All right, we're going to try this again. I'm not sure what happened. Let me get back over here. Let me get into my studio. Ooh, I don't know if anybody's... I'm back on live now. I'm not sure what happened, and I don't know if you guys can still find me, but we're going to see what happens. I don't know. What's going on over here? Okay. So I got a question here. I don't see if any. I don't know if anyone's with me. So here's my. I'm back live. So I don't know if anyone's here. So if you're here, I have a question that just popped up, and I might as well use it to see if anybody else joins me. The question is, what are my DBQ predictions this year? Here's where I'm going to go with my DBQ predictions. I think it's going to be from time period 3. If it's from time, and the reason why I say time period 3 is we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of America this year. And so that would just make sense to me that it would be from time period 3. Also, it's been a while since we've had a DBQ from time period 3. Now, just because I said that doesn't mean it's accurate. Just my thoughts. So that's kind of where I'm at with that one. So, okay, some people are finding me, guys. Guys, I apologize. I don't know what happened to my stream. It just shut off. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if there's a storm around here, but it says I have an excellent connection, so I'm just going to press on. I apologize. I have no idea where it cut off for you. I was in the middle of talking about time period 2 in English colonization and the regions. Now listen, I'm not going to go into these in-depth definitions. I have a tendency to want to dive too deep into everything, and so you guys are going to have to keep me honest. Keep throwing questions at me, and I'll try to answer them the best I can as we go. But here's the bottom line: for time period 2, you need to know the British colonial, the colonial regions. You need to know the New England colonies. You need to know the Chesapeake colonies, and you need to know the middle colonies and the southern colonies. Know the different regions. Know how they made their money. Know about their environment. These regions, these colonial regions, were developed based on their environment. They withdrew the economic resources based on the environment they had. So if I'm living up in the New England colonies, we know there's a lot of timber up there. We know there's a lot of deep water ports. So that means shipbuilding, logging, that kind of stuff. If I'm down in the South, we have long growing seasons. We have good moisture. So we're going to see cash crops down there. And the middle colonies, it's kind of, like I said, a mixture between the two. So you're going to see a lot of trade, but you're also going to see the breadbasket, a lot of growing of grains and stuff like that. So make sure you know the different colonial regions, because the entire reason that these colonies were created for England was to make England money. And the economic system that England is going to use in the colonies is mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is the idea of, you have all these countries, all these empires, they are competing for a finite amount of wealth that's in the world. And that's why they're colonizing, that's why they're exploring. They're trying to extract as much wealth as they can from the world. And by doing, and what mercantilism is when these colonies are used to provide economic benefits for the mother country. So the English colonies are actually making money for England. If that was not the case, England would not keep sending people to these colonies. So and then under mercantilism, the colonies are going to have many more exports than they do imports. So they're going to be exporting all their raw materials to England where England's going to be able to manufacture them and sell them to other places in the world. That leads me to a major part of the mercantilistic economic system that was taking place in time period 2, and that's triangular trade. Triangular trade is going to be driven by this 3-pronged trade between the North American colonies, Europe and Africa. Now, the colonies are sending their raw materials over to Europe, and then Europe is manufacturing those. And in the manufacturing, what they're going to do is, hang on. Okay. What what they're going to do is they're going to manufacture, and they're going to use those manufactured goods, and they're going to go and trade in Africa for slaves. African slaves then make up what's called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is that part of the triangular trade route between Africa and the North American colonies. Brutal, brutal, brutal transportation of human beings across the ocean. But that is how the African slave trade really gets going during time period 2. So mercantilism is the primary economic system used by England. Triangular trade is essentially the revenue stream that keeps England, financially secure. Okay, so you know the regions of the colonies. Now you know the economic system of the colonies. Now let's talk about the interactions with Native Americans. Now, Native Americans are present in every single time period of U.S. history. So you have to know something about the Native Americans in every single time period. Well, what we're going to find is the same story over and over and over again. As the colonies expand, the Native Americans face conflict, and conflict typically leads to war. And it's no different with the English colonies. Will there be questions about triangular trade? I would assume so. I don't know if it's going to be a direct question, but I mean, I can't tell you exactly which questions there will be. I can tell you what I'm talking about is in the curriculum, so it's available for questioning. It also can be used for context when you're writing essays. So understanding this stuff is going to help you do that. So anyway, this idea of the conflict with the Native Americans, I think during time period 2, the big one you need to know is King Philip's War. King Philip's War is also known as Metacom's War. And what you had was, up in New England, you had British encroachment on Native American lands, which means the British colonies are expanding their land holdings and they're moving into Native American lands. Now, you're going to have in King Philip's War what Metacom, that's King Philip, he is going to build an alliance amongst the Native American tribes up in New England, specifically the Wampanoag and their allies. And they're going to try to push back against the English colonies, who actually are going to ally with the Mohawk, who was the enemy of the Wampanoag. Now, do you need to know all these details? No, absolutely not. What you need to know, though, is the relationships that existed between the colonies and the Native Americans. Sometimes they allied themselves with them. Sometimes they fought against them. But this is what was going on. And so if you understand, that these wars typically are going to happen because of the encroachment on Native American lands, because of the expansion of first the colonies and then later the United States, it always leads to conflict. Okay, that's a continual cause and effect throughout history. As we expand, it leads to conflict. Okay. The British colonies also, like the Spanish colonies, are going to need a labor force to help them extract wealth and to help them, do the agricultural bidding of Great Britain and stuff. They are going to start with indentured servants. Now, indentured servitude provided a means for the lower socioeconomic class of Europe to make their way over to North America to maybe get a fresh start. It was a tough life to live as an indentured servant, if you lived at all. But what's going to happen is we're going to become dependent on indentured servants until we couldn't be anymore. Because it's going to happen in the colony of Virginia, specifically in Jamestown in 1676, that a number of newly freed indentured servants, because indentured servants worked for a short period of time. Once they gained their freedom, they earned freedom dues, and sometimes it was a little plot of land. And what we found was a number of these indentured servants were getting garbage land. And they're going to go to the government in Virginia saying, we want to expand westward. We need your support in fighting off the Native Americans so we can continue to expand. And the government said no. When that happened, Francis Bacon is going to lead what's known as Bacon's Rebellion. Now, there's going to be a lot of fighting, and Jamestown is going to get burned down, and England's going to have to send reinforcements to help put down Bacon's Rebellion. But this is what you need to know about Bacon's Rebellion. You need to know that due to Bacon's Rebellion, the English colonies start to shift away from indentured servants to using African slaves. Now, African slaves had been in the colonies since 1619, but we were using very few of them. We weren't reliant on them because we had the indentured servitude program. When Bacon's Rebellion happened, we saw a problem using indentured servants, because if these guys are going to rebel against us, others will in the future too. So we need to find a labor force that ain't going to rebel against us. And that's when we started seeing the use of African slavery. It's 1676. This is when it happened. And you're going to see a major uptick in the use of African slaves from that point going forward. Okay? You're also going to see slaves revolt at sometimes. I mean, they said we're going to bring slaves in so they don't revolt, but they will. And one of the biggest revolts during this time period 2, is going to be the Stono Rebellion in 1739. That's going to take place in South Carolina. You're going to see the slaves basically steal weapons from a store. They killed the owners. They're trying to get down to Spanish Florida where they can get their freedom. The rebellion is put down. But, thank you very much. When the rebellion was put down, every time we see a slave rebellion, it's going to have a long-term effect. And that effect is going to be, it's going to increase more and more fear in the Southern slave owners. And that fear is going to drive more and more laws about how. Okay, so that's that. The last thing I want to talk about is the character of the, it's buffering. It keeps doing that. I don't know why it's buffering, because it says I have an excellent connection. When I look at the stream health, it says excellent. I don't know what else to do except just keep pressing on. So that's what we'll do. When we look at this, there's two major movements during this time period, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. Now, these are two completely different movements, but they have the same effect. The Enlightenment movement is going to introduce us to natural rights, people like John Locke, Baron Montesquieu, and others, Voltaire. And what the biggest thing that they're going to teach us is that we have a social contract with the government. And if the government's not doing their job, that contract allows us to step out and get a new government. And the government's job, according to John Locke, is to protect our natural rights, the rights of life, liberty, and property. But when that doesn't happen, we have the right and we have really a duty to throw off that government and get a new one. So that's what the Enlightenment teaches us. And the Enlightenment goes into a lot of other things, but it starts this idea of independent thinking. We start thinking about our government. We start seeing our government not just as something that is put in there as a permanent, just because you're born into a royal family makes you an automatic governor. No, we're starting to see we have a voice in government. So this independent thinking is starting to evolve early in the 1700s. At the same time, the First Great Awakening is taken off, and the First Great Awakening is a religious revival throughout the colonies led by people like John Edwards and George Whitefield. And what they are going to do is they are going to start talking about the freedom that we have in our Christian faith. That the freedom we have to choose that Christian faith and everything. And so both of these movements start talking about the individual freedom we have. And we start seeing ourselves more as individuals that can make these decisions about our faith, about our government. And those two ideas, while they run parallel to each other, are going to come to a cross section in the 1770s where we're like, we can make change in our life and we have the power to do that. So there you have time period 2. So again, just recap to period 2. Know the colonial regions. We're talking about time period 3. So bear with me because I kicked off and I'm coming back. So now I'm back and we're going to talk some more. And again, I totally apologize for this. I don't know if everybody's on YouTube tonight. Maybe they are because there's an APUSH exam tomorrow. They're all supposed to be watching Heidler though, so I don't know why I keep getting kicked off. But anyway, we're just going to keep going, and I'll just keep doing this, and I'm sorry for the hassle. So, all right, we're going to go on into time period 3. Time period 3 is really going to basically, that's when you're going to All right, it keeps reconnecting. Oh my goodness. I'm going to put you guys on the title screen just for a minute. You're going to see the title screen. I'm going to go look at my settings and see if there's anything I can do to fix this. So let's just take a break. Go get yourself something to drink real quick. I'll be right back. All right, we're reconnecting. This is the biggest cluster ever. So I appreciate you, Alyssa, that it is my awesomeness that's interrupting it. I'm gonna have to go with that. I know I don't disagree with you at all. Yes, I'm absolutely going to talk about FDR. Considering if I stay online, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm sorry. This is frustrating. Then my dog is growling at me. So just one more thing to deal with. All right, time period 3. Yeah. You know what? It's because I'm out of practice. That's the problem. I haven't done these, like I said at the beginning. I have not done these for some time, and I thought my streaming platform was all good to go, and I updated everything, and I was wrong. Life goes on. Okay, so time period 3. Time period 3 starts in 1754, goes to 1800. This is the time period that the United States is essentially developed. 1754 marks the beginning of the French and Indian War. 1800 marks the Revolution of 1800, or the election of Thomas Jefferson. So what do you need to know about this time period? Really, you need to know the road to the American Revolution. And it actually starts with the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was a war between England and France over the Ohio River Valley and essentially control of the North American land holdings. England is going to end up winning that war, and the colonists think, wonderful, we won, so now we get to share in the benefits of being the victor of this war. What they didn't know was that England did not have the money nor the manpower to essentially oversee this entire territory. So when the colonists started moving to the west, the Native Americans are going to once again push back. Are you seeing a theme here? We start to expand west, and the Native Americans are not happy. So what's going to happen in 1763? Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac's Rebellion is a direct effect of colonial expansion west following the French and Indian War. When Pontiac's Rebellion took place, England realized there's no way that we can protect all of these western lands as well as the colonists, as well as keep control. So what England did was they put a buffer between the colonists and the Native Americans. It's called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And when they did that, they told the colonists, you cannot cross. You can't go into that land. Even though you fought in that war with us, you can't go into that land. And when that happened, the colonists are going to get very angry. Not as angry as saying we're out of here, but they're like, well, that's not fair. It's pretty much what they're saying is that's not fair. We fought in this war. In fact, you came to us before this war, and we had our little meeting up in Albany, and we had this Albany Plan of Union. Yeah, it was rejected, but we've been trying to help you all along, and that it just didn't work out. So now the Proclamation Line of 1763 is put in place, and here's the thing, and I think sometimes we forget this. The English not only told the colonists, you can't go west of that line, they told the Native Americans, this land is reserved for you. So don't worry, no one else is coming. Wink, wink, nod, nod. You know what's going to happen. So anyway, Proclamation Line aside, most of the colonists were like, well, we can deal with that and everything. But then things really got intense because Great Britain said, that war cost us all this money. And England, colonies, we want you to start paying for that war. So we're going to see a series of taxation during that time, be it the Stamp Act or the Townshend Acts. All of those taxes are put in place in order to pay for the debt that was accrued from the French and Indian War. This is where the colonists are going to get frustrated because during time period 2, while they were developing their own colonies, they were also developing their own governments. You had the Virginia House of Burgesses. You had the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. You had town meetings happening everywhere. And now all of a sudden, Great Britain, who's been practicing what we call salutary neglect, meaning we're leaving you alone because you're making us money. Now all of a sudden, England's coming in saying, now we want to rule you. And I think I used in class the example as if, like, the laws were already always there, but they just weren't being followed and they weren't being enforced. And I think in class I used the example that if you had a curfew that was never enforced, and so you came and went whenever, however you wanted, then all of a sudden your parents said, oh no, wait a minute, now you have to be home every night by 9 o'clock, you'd be kind of mad about that. Because now all of a sudden they're enforcing a rule that, yes, has always been there, but has never been enforced. That's exactly what England is doing to the colonies. They're going to start enforcing all of their rules, plus new rules, new taxes that are coming in. And this is where you're going to start seeing the colonies push back. They're going to start by some organization. They're going to have the Stamp Act Congress to try to appeal to England to repeal the Stamp Act, which England does. But not before they have to deal with the Sons of Liberty, who are tarring and feathering all the tax collectors and the boycotts that are going on. Well, then they repeal the Stamp Act, and then they say, oh, and we're like, cool, no new taxes. And they're like, oh, new tax. Here's the Townshend Act. And the Townshend Act was a tax on glass and paper and lead, and the big one, the tax on tea. And so now we're mad again. So the Sons of Liberty come back. And the Sons of Liberty come back and they start going after the tax collectors. The Daughters of Liberty start organizing boycotts. We're not buying any English goods at all. And then once again, they repeal all of the taxes of the Townshend Act except the tea tax. And then things were quiet for a while. And then in 1773, Great Britain is going to pass the Tea Act. The Tea Act wasn't a tax on tea, guys, because that was already there. The Tea Act was it was Great Britain implementing a monopoly. They were limiting what tea would be sold in the colonies. And they said, you have to buy this tea from the Dutch East India Trading Company, and this is the only tea you can buy. Well, that's when the colonists got mad, because they're like, well, we don't want to buy your tea. We want choices, because we love choices. And so that's going to be what spurs the Boston Tea Party. And the Boston Tea Party, of course, is when the Sons of Liberty, dressed up like Native Americans, dumped all that tea into Boston Harbor, cost millions of pounds in revenue to the English Parliament. Now Parliament is mad. This is when things take a turn, because what Parliament did was they instituted what's called the Intolerable Acts on Boston. Sometimes they're also referred to as the Coercive Acts. Intolerable Acts, Coercive Acts, same thing. Basically what they did, they shut down Boston Harbor, said you can't trade anymore until you pay us back for all the tea. They shut down all the self-government in Massachusetts with the Massachusetts Governing Act. They send more troops into Boston to start enforcing these laws. And what we start to see is England taking a tighter and tighter control of specifically the Massachusetts colony, but this idea that this tight control is going to spread to the other colonies. And so like the committees of correspondence, they're sending messages back and forth saying, hey, if it happened to Boston, it could happen to you as well. This is when the First Continental Congress is going to meet. And the First Continental Congress, what they're going to do, honestly, is they are going to appeal to Great Britain. They're going to say, okay, let's try to get along. They're going to send a declaration of, not the declaration, but a declaration over of their rights and grievances over to England and stuff like that. And they're saying, we're going to try to just to bring things back to a status quo. Let's just get back to loving one another. But here's the kicker in the First Continental Congress. Just in case we can't work this out, why don't we go ahead and start putting together some militias in all the colonies? Why don't we just start training just in case? And why don't we, I don't know, think about appointing a leader of a continental army? And so they started, it's kind of one of Boston. And this is going to lead to the very first battle of the American Revolution. And that's going to be the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And these are the first shots that are going to be fired in the American Revolution. But we are not at war yet. Because even though these were the first shots fired in the American Revolution, we are still trying to make peace with Great Britain. In fact, we're going to send them the Olive Branch Petition. The Olive Branch Petition is our last-ditch effort to have peace with Great Britain, telling the king, can't we please just go back to the way things were prior to all of this schmuck back to about 1763. King says no, and he said no for a number of reasons, but the number one reason he said no was because we had just fought the Battle of Bunker Hill, and even though England won that battle, they lost a whole lot of men. So when the king said no, this is when the Second Continental Congress is going to come together. This is going to be when they draft the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence, know this date, July 4th, 1776. And what we're going to see here is the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, is going to be modeled after a lot of the Enlightenment ideas that were meaning why they were declaring independence. So that same year. So all of this is kind of happening at once. Once we declare our independence, we're going to be fighting in the American Revolution. I'm just going to jump ahead. We win. And with our victory, we now become an independent nation. During that time period, when we were fighting in the American Revolution, we had to establish a government. The government we established was called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were essentially set up to get us through the war and to be as opposite of England as we could. So when the Articles of Confederation were created, they were very weak. All the power was going to the state governments, and we had a very weak central government. We didn't have an executive branch. We didn't have a judicial branch, just a legislative branch. And each colony had one representative in that legislative branch. And it was very difficult to get laws passed. It was very difficult to get anything done. After the war, it became very apparent how weak the Articles were, because we're going to have another rebellion, and this one is Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is going to happen in western Pennsylvania, right? I think so. No, western Massachusetts. Help me out, Ms. Pahovich. I'm drawing a blank right now because I'm dealing with my streaming issues here. The Shays' Rebellion, what essentially happened was you had a whole bunch of farmers who property taxes were getting too high. They couldn't pay them, so they were foreclosing on their property on their farms. Lose your farm, you lose all your money. So they're going to put together, Massachusetts, thank you. They're going to put together a rebellion. They're going to march to the courthouses in Massachusetts, and they are going to demand that they are given their farms back. Well, Massachusetts did not have an army to put this rebellion down. In fact, the United States didn't have an army to put this rebellion down, and there was no one who had the power to build an army. So what's going to happen is we're going to realize that our government was way too weak. So it's at this point that we say we need to get together and we need to restructure our government. That's going to lead to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia, and it's there that we develop our U.S. Constitution. Now, it wasn't easy. We didn't just all get together and say, hey, we got this idea. We said, oh, good, let's roll with it. We had a lot of compromises we had to make. You had compromises dealing with representation. You had compromises dealing with slaves. How should slaves be counted? And so all of this is going to come together, and what you're going to see is two plans are going to come together, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, and they form what we call the Great Compromise. And it's the Great Compromise that creates a bicameral legislature in our country, with the House of Representatives that is set up based on population. So the number of representatives each state has is based on the number of people who live there. So the higher the population, the more representatives you have in the House, which might seem unfair if you're a small state with low population. But don't worry, bicameral means two houses. The second house is the Senate. And in the Senate, every single state has equal representation. So why is this so important? This prevents what we call a tyranny of the majority. If it was just based on population, all the populated areas, the heavy populated areas of our country would make every single decision in our country that's going to be made. And the smaller states would really have no voice at all. And so they would fall under tyranny of the majority. They would either have to do what was decided or leave society altogether. And so that's why having the Senate, where you have those equal representation, where everyone has the same voice, is so important. Because in our system, laws can't be passed unless they're passed by both the House and the Senate. So that way, every single voice is heard. So our new Constitution is going to be created. It's going to have all sorts of bells and whistles like separation of powers and checks and balances. And you might want to be familiar with some of that stuff. I'm just flying through this, but you know, that's what we do on anti-federalists. So let's talk about this debate, because this was all about ratification of the Constitution. The Federalists supported the Constitution. They supported a large or a strong central government, and they believed that the Constitution was going to meet the need of our country. The Anti-Federalists believed the central government had too much power, and so they were against ratification. And so this debate between these two groups is going to basically just, you know, run the risk of preventing the Constitution from being ratified. Thankfully, three guys, Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, are going to write a whole bunch of essays for the state of New York explaining why the Constitution is going to work. It's called the Federalist Papers. And what's eventually going to happen is the Anti-Federalists are going to agree to back the Constitution if they add a Bill of Rights to it, because they were worried that a central government would have too much power and that power would overshadow the individual rights of the people. So we want those rights added into the Constitution, knowing that they would be protected. And so the Anti-Federalists are going to acquiesce to the Federalists. They're going to back the Constitution because James Madison promises to add a Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution, and he does just that in 1791. One cool thing about our U.S. Constitution was it created an executive branch and a judicial branch, which we didn't have under the Articles of Confederation, which leads us to our very first president, George Washington. And you guys so eloquently said today in class that George Washington probably affected a lot of the change in our country just by being the first president, because he's going to lay the foundation of presidencies going forward. He's going to set all of these precedents that other presidents will follow after him. He's probably best known for his neutrality proclamation, and he, you know, where he stayed out of the French Revolution, and that idea of neutrality becomes a foundational characteristic of the United States for the next 120 years. We don't want to get involved in foreign entanglements. Now, we had a great talk today about, well, what about, you know, when we got involved in the War of 1812, or what about, you know, the XYZ affair and everything. All of that dealt with defending ourselves. It didn't involve going over and getting involved in other people's problems. So the Neutrality Proclamation is going to carry us through not only the 1700s and the 1800s, but partially into the 1900s as well. In Washington's farewell address, he's going to make the point that we shouldn't have political parties. Well, I think he made that point because during his presidency, we already saw political parties being formed. We're going to see the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans being formed. This is our first political party system. The Federalists typically supported a strong central government, where the Democratic Republicans supported more power to the states. So when that happened, you know, this is the beginning of political parties in our country, and Washington was just going to warn us against that. It didn't last, because in the second presidential election, you're going to have Federalist John Adams running against Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. And with our ships, they wanted a bribe, and they said no way. And he's like, I'm not going to give them a dime, and that's going to lead us to fighting the quasi-war with France for the next year or so. But then he also had the Alien and Sedition Acts, and this is the one he takes the hit on, because here we see him essentially suppress the free speech of the press, because he made it illegal for anybody to write anything negative about him in newspapers and stuff like that. And, you know, anytime we're in times of conflict, it is not uncommon for our government to start restricting our civil liberties. It's happening with Adams while the French Revolution was going on. We're going to see it happen with Wilson during World War I. We're going to see a little bit of it during World War II. We even saw it during the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln when he suspended habeas corpus. So that's another continuity that happens throughout our histories. During times of war or security threats against the United States, our civil liberties are often suppressed for a while in order to protect us, is the way it's explained to us. So that's a quick overview of time period 3. Mr. Squid Bacon, what do I think the DBQ will be on tomorrow? I've said several times in my class, and I said it earlier on this one, I think it's coming out of time period 3. but I have no idea. I see students across the country on all of these different reviews saying, what do you think it's going to be? What do you think it's going to be? And I see teachers on all these platforms saying, what do you think it's going to be? What do you think it's going to be? Someone's going to be right, but most of us are going to be wrong. That's the big thing. Yeah, so Ms. Behovich thinks it's time period 4. I think we had one. I think we haven't had one on time period 3 in a while. That's kind of where I'm going with the DBQ. So we shall see. Couple of things with foreign relations I should point out from time period 3 is a couple treaties that are going to be signed. Just because we're neutral doesn't mean we're not talking. We're going to sign Jay's treaty with Great Britain during this time. We're going to sign Pinckney's treaty with Spain during this time as well. So make sure you understand that we're always involved in foreign policy in one way or another. All right, I'm going to jump ahead to time period 4. Reconnection successful. I'm going to have to talk to my internet provider. Everything else is working in my house, just not my computer. All right, time period 4, 1800 to 1848. 1800 is the election of Thomas Jefferson. 1848 is the Seneca Falls Convention. A lot of stuff happens in this time period. We are going to develop our character as America during this time period. Thomas Jefferson is going to get us started with the purchase of Louisiana, just going to double the size of our country. He was a Democrat Republican, believed that our economy should be based on agriculture. So based on that, he's going to double the size of our country in order to get all this land for agriculture. That's one major big thing he does during this time. But that doesn't mean he did everything great during this time. A lot of people thought that that purchase of Louisiana went against his core values, which was the strict interpretation of the Constitution. And they were right. It did go against that viewpoint. But he kind of said, so what? I did it. And he negotiated. He said, well, I got the power to negotiate treaties, so I guess he used that to do that. But make sure you do understand the difference between strict interpretation and loose interpretation of the Constitution. Strict interpretation basically means I am going to interpret the Constitution word by word, verbatim. Loose interpretation says, I'm going to read between the lines. There's some gray areas there. There's the intent of what the writers thought they wanted. So that's the big difference between the two. And Thomas Jefferson, without a doubt, was a strict constructionist. He believed in the strict interpretation of the Constitution. And the Louisiana Purchase did go against that interpretation. We're going to see... During this time, we're going to see the Supreme Court is going to take its role in our country. And of course, I know you're going to shout it out at home, but I'll just go ahead and say it. Marbury v. Madison, judicial review. Judicial review, Marbury v. Madison. I can't stress that enough. And I said it in class and I'll say it again. If you ever see a multiple choice question that has Marbury v. Madison in the title, you are going to see judicial review as the answer. It's that simple. And vice versa. So say it with me. Marbury v. Madison, judicial review. Got it? Okay. That was the first major case, and why it's so important is going to basically determine, or not determine, but create the power of the Supreme Court. We finally have a view of who can who will interpret the Constitution. This has been something that's been debated since we started, since the Constitution came out. Who has the role of interpretation? And during Adams' administration, we talked about in class the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, when Jefferson and Madison said the states had that power. Well, here with Marbury v. Madison, judicial review, we say no, it's the Supreme Court that has that authority. You're going to see other cases coming out during this time from the Marshall Court. John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. A couple that you need to be familiar with, other than Marbury v. Madison, judicial review, is McCulloch versus Maryland. In McCulloch versus Maryland, the big idea is that federal law trumps state law. So federal law, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Going forward further into time period 4, the next big thing that's happened is going to be the War of 1812. That is what some people call the Second American Revolution, or Mr. Madison's War. This was a war that we fought with England for several reasons. Number one, they were impressing our sailors upon the high seas. Number two, they were arming Native Americans on the western frontier. And number three, we had a lot of people in Congress who were now the second generation of Americans, and they wanted their own war. So we are going to go to war against Great Britain in 1812. James Madison is the president by this point. It's, I mean, the war lasts about 2 years. Washington, D.C. gets burned down, and it ends up in a tie. We're going to sign the Treaty of Ghent, but before we could sign the Treaty of Ghent, a young guy by the name of Andrew Jackson is going to win a big battle down in New Orleans called the Battle of New Orleans. And when we find out about the Treaty of Ghent and we find out about the Battle of New Orleans, obviously we assume that America has won the war. And what that's going to spur is a time period called Ghent nationalism. And Ghent nationalism was not just a time period about celebrating the victory in the war. Ghent nationalism was also a time period when there was no war. Because by this point in history, there was no war going on in Europe. America was not involved in any wars, and it was really a time of peace. And it was during this time that the Industrial Revolution is going to hit America, and we're going to go through what was called the Market Revolution. Our country's expanding, our country's growing, and now one thing that's helping our country grow is all these new inventions. The telegraph, the cotton gin, the spinning jenny, the mechanical reaper, the John Deere's steel plow. All of this is going to help America grow economically. Well, to help that growth, Henry Clay is going to introduce what's called the American system. The American system was really one of our first economic plans. Yes, we had Hamilton's financial plan under Washington, but Clay's American system was designed to build a full national economy. And his American system was based on creating a second national bank, infrastructure, and a new protective tariff. And that protective tariff would help encourage more industrial production by U.S. factories and U.S. industries. So when you think of the American system, just realize that what Clay is trying to do is build the American economy. And so that's going to happen during this era of good feelings. But as I said, we are expanding. And we never really had a big discussion about what happens when we expand. And what I'm talking about is when we add new states. Are they going to be slave states or are they going to be free states? That was one of the big debates during the Constitutional Convention, is should we count slaves towards representation? And we agreed upon the 3/5 compromise. But now as new states are starting to enter into the Union, are those going to be slave states or free states? Because that's going to have a direct effect on representation in Congress. And that's really what we're debating. We're not debating the morality of slavery. We're debating the numbers of slavery and the effect that has on the power we have in Congress, the voice we have in Congress. And early, and I'm backtracking a little bit, but early legislatures under the Articles of Confederation actually drafted the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance, in that territory, they said there was going to be no slaves. So I think some people assumed that that is Josh Allen right there. There he is right there. Josh Allen. Yeah, some people assumed that I'm sorry, I got distracted. Some people assumed that because of the Northwest Ordinance, every new territory that came into the United States would be free, would not allow slavery. But that just wasn't the case. And Missouri is the perfect example of that. Missouri is going to apply for statehood, and they want to come in as a slave state. That's going to cause a major debate between those slaveholding states and non-slaveholding states, and that's going to lead to the Missouri Compromise. This is one of the first major compromises dealing with the expansion of slavery in our country, so you want to be sure you understand the Missouri Compromise. That this is going to allow Missouri to come in as a slave state, and to balance things out, Maine is going to come in as a free state. And we're going to set a geographical boundary, the 3630 line, and everything north of that line will be free. Everything south of that line will be slave. That was supposed to solve all our problems. It didn't solve all our problems, but that's okay. It worked for right now. So that Band-Aid basically is going to go onto our country, and we're going to continue to grow. I absolutely will review the LEQ as soon as I'm done with this time period, okay? And between time period 4 and time period 5, I will talk about the LEQ with you guys. So here we go. Excuse me. Swallowed air. Okay, so we have the Missouri Compromise. That's going to take us into the 1820s. Another major event that happens during the 1820s is going to be the Monroe Doctrine. This is going to be foreign policy, and foreign policy is about, we're still trying to maintain neutrality, but we're kind of feeling our oats. We're kind of feeling kind of proud of who we hemisphere. So his presidency ends with that Monroe Doctrine. Let me put this in real quick. All right, so going forward from that, we go into the 1820s, and things kind of get a little wonky during the 1820s. We see during the 1820s, in the election of 1824, we see we're in a single-party system, and in this single-party system, we have all these candidates running as Democrat Republicans, and there's no clear winner. Andrew Jackson, our hero from the Biden exchange, he became the Secretary of State. This is going to anger Andrew Jackson. He is going to start campaigning right then and there for the election of 1828. In the meantime, what's going to start happening is you're going to see more and more states start to remove property requirements from voting. It's kind of known as the age of the common man because we're giving voting rights to more and more white men. It's called universal white male suffrage. All white men are going to be able to vote, which really bodes well for Andrew Jackson because he was kind of seen as a man's man. He's like the guy you want to sit and have a drink with. And so he kind of campaigns on that. And with that, we're going to move towards the election of 1828. And it's that election that's going to usher us into the age of Jackson. Now, before I get to the age of Jackson, I do want to touch on, I want to make sure I'm hitting everything from this time period that I need to. I'm just blowing by it all. So I'm just going to keep going. If you guys have questions, you can ask. But so Andrew Jackson's going to come in, and when he comes in, he's going to have a lot of controversy in his presidency. Some of it not his fault, some of it his fault. One of the first things he's going to have to deal with is a tariff that was passed during the end of John Quincy Adams' presidency. It's called the Tariff of Abominations. And as a result of this tariff, southern states are going to be angry because those tariffs cost them a lot of money. As a result of that, you're going to see South Carolina is going to, quote, nullify the tariff, meaning they're going to refuse to collect it. They're going to refuse to acknowledge that law even exists in their state. This leads to what's known as the nullification crisis. A lot of people thought that Jackson was going to kind of go in line with South Carolina because he's from the South and he had a lot of the same beliefs. But Jackson also believed in maintaining the Union. And so he is actually going to work with Congress. They're going to pass the force bill. And he was given the authority to use the military to go down into South Carolina and to force them to collect this tariff. In the end, they're going to negotiate a lower tariff. But what's important about this nullification crisis is you're starting to see some of the states kind of pushing back against federal law, kind of pushing back against a strong central government. And that idea of nullification is not going to go away. And it's especially going to come in play around 1860, 1861, right before that nasty Civil War gets started. Now, the nullification crisis kind of ushered Jackson into his presidency, but he's going to have a couple other conflicts. He is going to veto the Second National Bank. He didn't see the bank as constitutional, even though it was in McCulloch versus Maryland determined to be constitutional. He didn't like it, so he's going to destroy the bank, and he's going to move all the federal funds to state banks because he believed that states should have more power, and he believed that the federal monies at the state level was easier to get to the common man versus having it at the federal level. So the bank war is another major controversy from his presidency. But I think what everybody remembers Jackson for is going to be the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Indian Removal Act was that legislation that was set up to remove Native Americans from their native lands, specifically in the Georgia area where the Cherokee lived, but also down in Florida, also in western Kentucky and western Tennessee where the Creek and the Choctaw lived as well. I'm talking time period 4 right now. Someone just asked me that. So anyway, so the Indian Removal Act is going to basically be the biggest controversy from Jackson's presidency, and it's going to actually lead to what we know as the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was part of Van Buren's presidency, but it all started with Jackson and the Indian Removal Act. So no one's answering, so I'll just put it in there. Okay, there we go. So that is Jackson's presidency very quickly. A couple movements during this time as well. We're going to see three movements actually during this time, or two movements that inspire a third. You were going to have the Transcendentalist movement during time period 4. The Transcendentalist movement was inspired by, it was a philosophical movement that was inspired by people like Ralph Waldo Emerson. And the idea was that man should embrace a relationship with nature and with this idea of human perfectibility, that we should be working towards attaining perfection, and we can do that by embracing a relationship with nature and all that's around us. It was inspired by the Romanticism movement over in Europe, and we can see Ralph Waldo Emerson said that moral perfection can be obtained, and we should all be working towards that. And it's going to inspire people like Henry David Thoreau and others. It's also going to inspire art and literature. The Hudson River School is going to be an inspiration of the Transcendentalist movement, and the Hudson River School is going to create uniquely American art during this time period. But there was another movement going on during this time, and it was called the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening is going to be a revival of religious enthusiasm throughout the United States, and it's going to start up in upstate New York, and it's going to make its way through the entirety of the United States, spread by people like Charles Finney and others, who are spreading this idea of democratizing, or bringing democracy into religion. And what I think the biggest thing that's going to come out of the Second Great Awakening is that it is the responsibility of the churches to bring a reformation to society's morality. And so they're going to start saying to the Christians, you have a job within society to bring morality back, because, we're kind of going down some dark areas and stuff like that. So it's up to you, the individual, to go in and help. Now, this happened at the same time that Emerson says that individuals can obtain moral perfection. So these two movements together, specifically though the Second Great Awakening, are going to inspire the reform movements of the 1830s and the 1840s. And we're going to see a lot of different reform movements, such as the temperance movement, the abolition movement. You're going to see prison reform during this time. And you're also going to see a movement for women's rights during this time. And all of this is inspired by these two movements. So that's a big part of time period 2. The abolition movement during the 1830s, 1840s was kind of a fringe movement to start with, but it will start to grow as we draw closer and closer to the 1850s. The women's movement, though, this is when women are really going to start stepping up, trying to step out of the shadow of the cult of domesticity, start calling for rights and equality in education, in voting rights, in legal rights, and all this other stuff. And that's going to culminate at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. It's at the Seneca Falls Convention that this was the first official women's rights movement in our country. And so this is really where the movement starts. It's gonna be a long-lasting movement, because, as you know, women are not going to get the right to vote until the 20th century with the 19th Amendment. But it starts right here in time period 4. And it's the Seneca Falls Convention that essentially brings an end to time period 4. So there you go. There is the rapid fire Unit 4 talking points. So what's great question. The difference between the cult of domesticity and Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood, time period 3. This was right during the American Revolutionary time. And what was said was that that women should be educated, because women have the role of passing on civic values to their children. It's the role of the woman to teach her sons, specifically, how to be good citizens in a republic. And so when we talk about Republican motherhood, I think that was kind of, elevating women in society, saying, this is your job. You got to get the kid, teach your sons how to be good, citizens. Now, the cult of domesticity kind of pulled back on that a little bit, in that you're not teaching your kids to be good citizens, because one of the reform movements during this time was education, and we're starting to see public education. So we don't need you to teach your kids to be good citizens, but you still have a sphere of influence in the home, and it's the mother's role in the home to instill moral values into their kids. And so the cult of domesticity was about the women being in the home and instilling these moral values. And it's going to become, though, more of a stay place where the women's sphere of influence is in the home, so women's place is in a home. Is kind of how it evolved. Okay, I hope that explains the difference. Julietta, prohibition was before the 19th Amendment, because prohibition was the 18th Amendment, and that's going to be followed by the 19th Amendment. Okay, relatively close to one another, but just put I'm just going to say it, put the amendments in order, and you'll see what came first. But yeah, so the prohibition first, then the 19th Amendment, but all right in the same time period, if you will. Okay, now I promised once I finished time period 4 that I was going to talk about the structure of the LEQ. The LEQ basically is, it shares some points with the DBQ. You have your thesis and your context. That's your first paragraph. That's 2 points right there. And then what you want to do is you're going to provide evidence towards, your LEQ, you're writing what you know. And so what I tell my students, and my students are listening or other students are listening, your LEQ body paragraphs are essentially SAQ answers. So you're going to pull in evidence to support your thesis, and then you just write it like an SAQ. So, for example, if I said, had an LEQ that said, how did the progressives transform the United States government between 1900 and 1920? Say that's my prompt. Or evaluate the extent of change of the government during the progressive era between 1900 and 1920. My body paragraphs, I would probably, like if my evidence was like the Pure Food and Drug Act or the Meat Inspection Act or trust busting, I would write that like an SAQ. So I would say one way that the progressives transformed the government during this time period was through the institution of trust busting, specifically the Sherman Antitrust Act. Then I would explain what that was, and then I'd explain how that changed government. And then I would do the exact same thing for the Pure Food and Drug Act. I'd just do TEA, topic, sentence, evidence, analysis. Okay? So you want you have your context, you have your thesis, you have your body paragraphs with evidence in there, and then and that's essentially it. I mean, don't make it harder than it is. The LEQ is only 15% of the exam. So I told my students today, and if it's just my students listening, I'm sorry you're going to hear it again. I would spend the first 20-25 minutes of the 100 minutes you have to write your essays. I'd spend the first 20-25 minutes planning first your LEQ, and then plan your DBQ. And then once you have that plan, start writing your DBQ, and then go back and write your LEQ. So that way you have plans for both, and you can basically get both done within those 100 minutes. I've had plenty of students who have run out of time after the DBQ. They only have 10 minutes left, but because they have their LEQ already planned out, they can get it written very quickly. How many pieces of evidence do you need? You need at least 2. 2 strong pieces of evidence. So if I say you need 2, I would write 3 to be safe. That would be my back for you, my recommendation for you. I haven't talked about FDR yet. I am happy to talk about FDR if you guys are okay with me jumping ahead to time period 7. So, there's a lot to talk about. I mean, I could do an entire review just on Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt's going to come into office. This is time period 7. I'll go ahead and do it. Let me get everything set up here. So I want to make sure I have everything. I keep notes with me, so I don't want to mislead you guys. I do use notes while I'm doing these. So we're talking time period 7. Time period 7 starts in 1900 and it goes to 1945, or 1890 is when it starts with that census of 1890. Goes to 1945. FDR comes in right in the middle of this time period. He's going to come into office in 1933, right at the beginning of the, yeah, no problem. He comes in right in the beginning of the Great Depression. No, 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 no. Let me, I'm going back and forth. Biggest key terms to know from Unit 4. People you need to know. Andrew Jackson's one of the big ones. You need to know Thomas Jefferson. You need to know James Madison. You need to know James Monroe. Know the presidents, absolutely. When you look at those, look at the big events from each of those presidencies, like the Louisiana Purchase. For James Madison, you want to know the War of 1812. You need to know the Embargo Act of 1807. I would know that. Also with James Madison, make sure you know the American system. Maybe get nationalism or nationalism. You also want to know through Jackson, make sure you know, like I talked about, the Bank War, the Nullification Crisis. You need to know the Indian Removal Act, Trail of Tears. Those are the stuff. Those are the big ideas from time period 4 you need to know. And I just went through those really, really fast. And I'm sorry if you need to go back and review, or if someone wants to type those into the chat, that would be great. But let's get back to FDR and the New Deal, because you're right. There is a lot going on in that New Deal, and you know, if I were you, so here comes FDR. He comes in. The Great Depression has kicked in. He says he has a new deal for the American people, and that new deal is built on what are called the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And what I would recommend, know an example of each one of those. Know an example of relief. Know an example of recovery. Know an example of reform. If you guys want to save me time, put some examples in the chat and help each other out if you could. Yeah, that's what I'm telling you right now. Know at least one program for the relief, recovery, reform. So if you know that, you'll be good. The New Deal, what it does is you are going to see major legislation come out that still exists today, like Juliana mentioned, the Social Security Act. So that's a major piece of that came out of the New Deal. FDIC is another major piece that came out of the New Deal. You're also going to have the things like the Tennessee Valley Authority. You're going to have the SEC. All of those are still in effect today. And so that's what, you know, I'm going to turn this off real quick. Sorry. I was hearing myself echo. Sorry. So know those programs. But it's not, you know, the New Deal, that's the 1930s. But also what's going on in the 1930s, Lizzie, is you have to understand that we're also dealing with the rise of World War II over in Europe. So the New Deal got us through the Great Depression. It didn't solve the Great Depression. And so that's going to be a big deal. What's going to get us out of the Great Depression is we're going to start ramping up our industry in order to support the allies over in Europe, specifically England. This, you know, even though we passed the Neutrality Acts, we're also going to go into pass like Lend-Lease and cash and carry. And so we're going to start, you know, our factories up and rolling, and that's going to be, and FDR is going to oversee that. And so once those factories gets going, we're going to slowly start pulling ourselves out of the Great Depression, because we have our economies coming back. And so we can talk about the New Deal, but the New Deal was FDR's response to the Depression, but it's going to be World War II that gets us out of the Great Depression. And so keep that in mind as you're looking at his presidency. And then, of course, he is going to be the commander-in-chief during our time in World War II, right up until about a month before it ends in 1945 when he passes away. So FDR, you know, in a nutshell, you know, Great Depression, New Deal, the 3 R's, and then World War II. So if you can kind of pull all that together, I don't know if that helps you, if I gave you enough information, or if you have other questions that I can answer for you. I see that someone put that the New Deal basically was no more laissez-faire and the government intervention to fix reforms. That's exactly it. This is the first time that, well, no, that's not the first time. Take that back. You're going to start to see laissez-faire fall off at the beginning of time period 7 with the progressive era, when you have Teddy Roosevelt's presidency and going into Taft's presidency and Woodrow Wilson's. That's when you're going to start seeing some reforms start to happen there. You're going to see reform with like the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. You're going to see reform with the Clayton Antitrust Act. So you are going to see government intervention start to kind of step in during the progressive era. But to your point, that is going to just take off tenfold during the Great Depression. No, sorry. Everyone's phone's probably going off right now, right? So yes, laissez-faire is over with. But that pretty much started to come to an end at the turn of the century, at the beginning of this time period, okay? So, Lizzie, I don't know, did that answer your question, or do I need to give you a little bit more information, or does it clarify it a little bit? Because I can break it down a little bit more in depth if that would help. I see you, Flynn. My dog's down here, wants attention. All right, I'm going to go ahead and circle back, and let's go back to time period 5. Time period 5 is essentially, that's where we're going to get into westward expansion. That's going to start in 1844. It's going to go to 1877. Yeah, that's a great question, Abby. You absolutely focus on at least one program for each R. A program for relief, a program for recovery, and a program for reform. And if you can talk about one, you're good to go. Here we go. For multiple choice tips, this is what I would tell you. The very first thing you want to do is read the question. Make sure you read the question clearly so you know exactly what they're asking. Then the next thing I would do is I would read the source. Understand the source, when it was written, put yourself in that time period. Sometimes you will read the source and you'll know exactly what they're asking. You don't even need to go to the actual stimulus, because if it says something like the Gettysburg Address, you know what it is. So, just go and look at the answers. But look at the source. Then once you look at the source, go and read the answers and see what's there. And then it's just, then you're going to go skim the stimulus and then go through process of elimination. There's always going to be 2 that are completely wrong and then 2 that are pretty close to right. And it sounds strange, but you go with the answer that's most right. Always look for like code words in there too. Like if they have answers in there like all or none, or everybody or nobody, those are disqualifiers, because nothing is all or nothing. Okay, so make sure you do that. Also, disqualifiers if it's in the wrong time period. If they're asking questions about the Civil War, it's not going to be an answer about the American Revolution. So you can eliminate that. So just work your way through, eliminate as you go, and then, choose the best answer. You're never going to find the answer directly in the reading, but the reading is going to guide you to the correct answer based on what's in the reading and your historical knowledge, okay? The exam is going to have the rubrics you need, but it's not going to be read like you see it on the rubrics we gave you in class. It's going to break down, though, what you do need to have in order to get points. So, but both the LEQ and the DBQ, you both get points for thesis statements. They both give points for contextualization. They both give points for evidence. In the LEQ, you need at least 2 pieces of evidence, but in the DBQ, you need 1 piece of evidence beyond the documents. So you get a point for both of them for evidence, and you get a point both for the complexity. So that's 4 points they share. The difference is the DBQ, you're using the documents. And with the documents, what I recommend is you use at least 4 documents, and we use SPY 4 documents in every in your DBQ. If you can get 5 done, even better. But don't put this pressure on there that you have to do all 7. Okay? Everything is on paper. Everything is on computer. So it's not a hybrid exam. Everything is on the computer, just like my students, just like we did in class. So all the multiple choices on computer, and all the SAQs are on computer, and all the essays are on computer. So, okay, all these good questions. I like questions because then I don't have to think as much. I can just answer. Okay? What do you guys want now? Do you want me to? I'm thinking I'm going to go back to time period 5, if you're okay with that. Otherwise, I'll answer more questions if you have those. You know, I am here to help you as long as you need me to help you. And we're only been here an hour and a half. It's still early. Okay, so I'm going to go back to time period 5. And time period 5, and you know, I'm not going to say anything about that. What are some name drops to remember? Yeah, I'm going to go unify. Name drops, Carolyn, I mean, I guess it just depends on the time period. Presidents are always good. The presidents are going to get you, you know, through this entire thing. So, if you can use those, if I can think of some names as I go through these, I will let you know. So any names I mention, you definitely, you know, will want to throw those in there. But I am going to move to time period 5. Lizzie, I see your question about court cases. Court cases you need to know, obviously, Marbury v. Madison, judicial review. McCulloch versus Maryland is the supremacy of the Supreme Court, or of the, gosh, I'm talking over too many words. McCulloch versus Maryland is the supremacy of the Constitution. Gibbons v. Ogden sets up the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to oversee and regulate interstate trade, business between the states. Worcester versus Georgia is one that you might want to know. Plessy versus Ferguson, not Posey. Plessy versus Ferguson. There you go. You fixed it. Plessy versus Ferguson. Absolutely need to know that one. Brown v. Board of Education. You need to know that one. Those are the ones you really need to know. Okay. You know, don't get into the weeds of like the Lochner's versus New York, or you know, you know, maybe Nixon versus the New York Times is one you might want to know, but that's kind of a random one as well. Okay, time period 5. Here we go. And Avery, you want the LEQ, the SAQ, the DBQ. I mean, they're going to cover the entire time periods. So I have no idea about all of them. Yeah, okay. So here we go. Time period 5. I've said that 3 or 4 times now. 1844 to 1877. Time period 5 starts with the election of Polk, ends with the end of Reconstruction. Time period 5 is all about expansion. It's expansion and the effects of expansion. Now, James K. Polk is going to come into office, and he's going to say, our manifest destiny, I'm going to complete that. We believed it was our manifest destiny to basically expand our country from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. And Polk says, I'm going to come in, and in one term, I'm going to get that done. And he did. He's going to reach an agreement with England over the Oregon Territory. We're going to fight in the Mexican-American War between 1846 and 1848. That's going to give us all the land between Texas and California. Texas actually came into the state into the Union as a state just before Polk takes office. But now we've got all this new land. And the question again becomes, well, how do we expand? What about slavery? And this is where the debate over slavery really starts to heat up. Because as a result of the Mexican-American War, the effect of that is going to be the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 brings California in as a free state. It's going to also determine or set up all the land we get from Mexico. Slavery is going to be determined by popular sovereignty, meaning the people get to vote. And then the big part of the Compromise of 1850 is a stronger fugitive slave law. So what does that mean? That basically means the federal government is going to support Southern slave owners when their slaves run away to make sure they get returned back to the South. And if that means they need help from Americans throughout the country, then they're going to require that. And and so you are required, if you know of a runaway slave, or you know of one, or if you're, caught hiding one, you could be held legally responsible. This is going to upset a lot of people because the slavery question was never a big deal because slavery was always down there. Well, now the slavery, quote, problem is making its way up north. This is when you're going to be, essentially, when you're going to start see the abolition movement rising and stuff like that. Dad, if you didn't finish half the textbook, that's okay because no one else reads the textbook. So we got it. We'll get you through it. Don't worry. It's all good. So anyway, so the Compromise of 1850 sets this up, and the Compromise of 1850 was kind of supposed to be like the Missouri Compromise. It was supposed to solve all our problems. It just caused more problems. So as we go into the 1850s, you're going to start to see a push for popular sovereignty, in these new territories, but what about that territory that was Louisiana? And what's going to happen is Stephen Douglas is going to push through what's known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act essentially said that in the Kansas territory, popular sovereignty will be allowed to determine whether or not slaves would be allowed. They essentially repealed the Missouri Compromise. And in doing that, now slavery can be moving north of that 3630 line. Well, no one, people in the North didn't want that, but people in the South did. So you're going to have pro-slavery advocates and anti-slavery advocates all converging into Kansas at the same time. And it's going to turn the competition for who's going to control that state turns violent, and we refer to that as Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas becomes this, I guess this micro version of what will be the Civil War. Blood is spilled over the question of the expansion of slavery. And so this is where we are in the 1850s. And then you add that, the next major thing that's going to happen in the 1850s, and Lizzie, I think it was you who was asking about Supreme Court cases, there was Dred Scott versus Sanford. And this was in 1857. And in 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that slaves are property, and as property, you can't, you're not a citizen, but also as property, the government can't control where you take your property. And so in a sense, what he did was he declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, which means, if you just read between the lines, that slaves can exist anywhere in the United States. Well, this is going to cause panic, and then you're going to have people debating this all over. And one place this debate is taking place is in Illinois, because you have this Senate race between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. And they start debating this idea of slavery. They start debating the Dred Scott decision. And it's going to be, the debates are going to be transcribed, and they're going to be printed all over the country. And this is kind of going to be what leads, Abraham Lincoln to become this national name. He's going to end up losing the Senate to Stephen Douglas, but his notoriety gets the attention of this new Republican Party, and they put him on the ticket in the election of 1860. Now, there's a lot of other stuff that goes on. You have the John Brown raid of Harper's Ferry, where he was going to try to raise a slave army and march through the South and kill everybody and free all the slaves and stuff. So all that's going on. But really, all of this expansion leads to this debate over slavery and where slaves are going to be allowed and stuff, and the expansion of slavery, because a lot of people ahead of this were like, just leave slavery where it is, and we're good to go. And but now we're between the Union and the Southern states. Now initially, all right, but Lincoln, all right. But Lincoln wants to maintain the Union. He wants to keep the Union together. So this is what they're fighting for. He's fighting to keep the Union together. The Civil War, there's really not much you need to know from the war. I would know the Battle of Antietam. That was the bloodiest battle, the bloodiest day in the war. Why that's important is because it's after the Battle of Antietam that foreign countries say we're not going to get involved. But more importantly, the Battle of Antietam is going to give Lincoln the political clout to get the Emancipation Proclamation signed off on. He's going to sign the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. And even though it doesn't doesn't free a single slave in the moment, it gives a moral reason to fight for the Union Army. The Anaconda Plan, that was the original plan that they were going to use to basically surround the South. We know it didn't work in the beginning, but eventually they're going to be able to split the South in two once Sherman marches to the sea, and that's going to lead to the Union victory. But if that's all you know about the Civil War, I mean, you don't need to know much more. You're okay with that. Just, like I said, know the Battle of Antietam, know the Emancipation Proclamation. The Battle of Gettysburg is important. That's the bloodiest battle in the war. That's where Lincoln's going to give the Gettysburg Address. That's also the furthest that Robert E. Lee got into the North during the war, and the South is going to be in retreat from that point on. The war is going to come to an end in Oh, wow, I'm really far behind. The war is going to come to an end in 1865 with the surrender at Appomattox. Lincoln has a plan for Reconstruction. It's called the 10% Plan. He's already gotten Congress to approve that's going to be the abolishment of slavery. As we work our way through Reconstruction, we're going to have two more Reconstruction amendments, the 14th and the 15th Amendment. You've got to know the Reconstruction Amendment, guys. That's one thing you absolutely have to know. As we go through Reconstruction, the radical Republicans, they're basically trying to get things going, doing it their way. We're going to see the Freedmen's Bureau set up during this time. We are going to see a lot of efforts by people in the South to try to eliminate the civil rights of the newly freed African Americans, specifically with black codes. You're also going to see the implementation of a new economic form of slavery called sharecropping that's going to limit African Americans and almost put them back in slavery. But this time it's not a physical slavery, it's an economic slavery. And so Reconstruction is going to last until about 1877. It's going to come to an end with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. And in order to get that election, there was a conflict with the electoral votes. And Rutherford B. Hayes offered a compromise. He said, if you give me the votes and put me into office, I will remove the federal troops from the South. And that effectively ends Reconstruction. So that marks the end of time period 5. So names you need to know from time period 5, obviously Abraham Lincoln, probably William Tecumseh Sherman. You need to know maybe Stephen Douglas. I would know Dred Scott. Harriet Beecher Stowe is a name I didn't talk about, but she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin during this time period. So those are some of the names you might want to know from this time period. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, there you go. Thank you, Don. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. You got to know those. You know what? I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think it made him unpopular because by the time he pulled the troops out of the South, the people in the North were tired of Reconstruction too. They were dealing, if you remember, and I didn't go into it, but they were dealing with an economic crisis of their own because in 1873 we had an economic panic. And so people were struggling economically. A lot of money was going down to Reconstruction, and a lot of people in the North and the West were upset that we were continuing to basically push all this effort into Reconstruction when nothing was being done in their area. So they're like, we're done with they were tired. And so did it make them unpopular? No, I don't think it did. I think it just because they were ready to be done with Reconstruction as well. That's a great question though. So, okay. Any other questions I can answer about period 5? If they come up, I'll circle back around because I keep my stream keeps buffering and it comes back to where I was when it buffered. So I've gotten quite a bit further ahead of you guys right now. So I might be asleep by the time you guys get to the end. But anyway, just kidding. All right, so we're going to move into time period 6. And time period 6 starts in 1865, and it's going to go all the way to 1898. We're essentially talking about the Gilded Age during this time period. Now listen, there is a lot of stuff that happens during the Gilded Age. A lot of things happening at the exact same time. And so that's sometimes what I think makes the Gilded Age that much more difficult to understand. I'm just going to try to methodically go through the Gilded Age and give you what I can. But westward migration is still going on during this time. During the Civil War, the Homestead Act was passed. So the American government is trying to settle the West, and they're doing that by giving land away. So you're going to see a growth of a mass of people starting to move west, and the railroad is going to, what's the word I'm looking for? The railroad is going to aid in this expansion. The other act that's going to be passed during the Civil War is the Pacific Railway Act. So right as we get to the end of the 1870s, you're going to see the Transcontinental Railroad is going to be completed, and then you're going to see a lot of other railroads being built. The government is very supportive of these railroads being built to the point that they're going to start subsidizing these railroads, because the more railroads they have, the more expansive our economy can become. So the government's going to start giving land grants. They're going to Bessemer process, and yeah. Bessemer process was introduced, and what that allowed for was the mass production of steel. And when we start talking about the mass production of steel, we're talking about the rise of industry in our country. And we got to talk about Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is going to be the master of steel. And he is going to use a new system of business operation. And in doing that, he was able to push out all the other competitors. The other one that is not vertical, but is horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is going to be implemented by J.D. Rockefeller. J.D. Rockefeller is going to use horizontal integration primarily with the refining of oil. He's going to control all the oil refineries in our country, and that's going to allow him to build his monopoly of Standard Oil. Now, both of these men and others are going to be able to build these monopolies because, as someone said, that we are during the it is during this Gilded Age that laissez-faire is the basic standing of our government, and laissez-faire means hands off. And the government was keeping out of it. They were just letting businesses evolve as they would. And, they're letting the economy evolve as it will, and they're just staying out of it completely. No regulations, no real laws about how to run business. They still have the Commerce Clause and all that, but they're not getting involved directly in any of this. So you're going to see later some type of business laws come into place, like the Sherman Antitrust Act and stuff like that, but they were very weak, and even though they were passed to try to combat the monopolies, they didn't have enough teeth in them to actually do much damage. Now, there's also going to start to see, you're going to see during the Gilded Age, is a division of wealth. A big divide between the haves and the have-nots. And the reasoning behind this is the big idea that comes out of this time period is social Darwinism, or the survival of the fittest. We pulled this from Charles Darwin's Darwinism idea, and that what these business owners were saying is, we had the ability to do it, and we just went out and did it. Everyone had the exact same opportunity we did, but we're the ones who did it. And so you can't be mad at us because we're successful at what we did. They did have some form of civic responsibility, because Andrew Carnegie is going to write the Gospel of Wealth, because he believed that that you should use one's wealth, you should use your money to make society better. And so you're going to see Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller and a few others start pumping some of their money back into society through various projects and donations. And you'll see, like, the Carnegie libraries are going to be built throughout the country. Carnegie Hall is going to be built. Rockefeller Center. All of these are going to be built from the funding of these monopolists through the social gospel. They didn't believe in handouts. They didn't believe in giving good, just money away. They still kept their costs down in their businesses because they're not paying their employees a lot, but they did believe their wealth should be used for the good of society, and that's the whole idea of the gospel of wealth. But like I said, they didn't pay their employees very well. The standard of living during the Gilded Age was tough, and you had a lot of people moving into the urban areas because that's where the jobs were. But then what they found is that the only place for them to live was in these tenements. And these tenements, poor ventilation, poor sanitation, a lot of people jammed into one room. And so they kind of turned into these slums. And that kind of became the living conditions throughout the cities during this time. And it was difficult to get out because you weren't getting much money from the different corporations. So you're going to see labor unions being formed during this time. One of the first labor unions formed is going to be the one of the first labor unions is going to be the Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor is going to, be formed in the early 1860s, and then another major labor union that's going to be formed is the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers. So you're going to see labor unions who come in who are going to try to get better working conditions for the employees, get better wages for their employees, get safer and shorter days for their employees. So they're trying to get better for their employees, but the labor unions are going to get a bad rap during this time period because they're going to be tied directly to socialism, and they're going to be seen as a threat to the American way of life. So while the labor unions are fighting for their workers, they're fighting against a perception of their political beliefs and their political ideologies. You might want to be familiar with several of the major strikes that took place during the time. The Great Railroad Strike in the 1870s is one you want to know. Carnegie's Homestead Strike in the 1890s is one. The Pullman Railroad Strike is another one that you're going to want to know. And what you might want to look into is the government's reaction to these strikes. In all of these, the government is going to step in and help the companies in breaking up these strikes. So you're going to see this, even though there's a laissez-faire perception, or there's a laissez-faire practice by the government, they essentially are going to, normally rule on the side of the unions. And yeah, the Sherman Antitrust Act absolutely was used against labor unions, but the Sherman Antitrust Act wasn't strong enough to pull them all down. It was a start. It was a start in the right direction, but it didn't have the power that it needed. And that's why when we get into the 1900s, the Clayton Antitrust Act is going to come in, and that will give the government more authority and more power. And you will see the government start stepping in more and fighting against these monopolies and ruling these monopolies as illegal and stuff like that. So you're absolutely right. That was there. So you got the unions going on. And that's happening. Immigration is a big thing during this time. We see the new immigrants starting to come in during the Gilded Age, and that's going to, most of them are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe during this time, and that also kind of spurs this fear of the rise of socialism because a lot of these immigrants are joining the unions and stuff like that. So you're kind of seeing all of that coming together. Not all of the unions accepted the immigrants because not the craft unions, but the industrial unions would allow immigrants to join. But the craft unions were anti-immigrant because they saw the immigrants as a threat to their union members, because immigrants would come in and take the jobs and get paid a lot cheaper. So it's also during this time you're going to see a rise of nativism, the fear of these immigrants and the effect they have on our economy, the effect they have on our culture. We're afraid of all of that during this time. So that's a big part of the Gilded Age. So far right now, I've talked about a lot of different things in the Gilded Age in like a 10-minute time period. We've talked about westward expansion. We've talked about the rise of industry. We've talked about the rise of monopolists and the capitalist. We've talked about the rise of labor unions, and now we've talked about urbanization, and we've talked about the rise of immigration. All of this is happening all at the same time. Meanwhile, I just thought of this, jumping all over the place, but down in the South, we've entered into an era of Jim Crow, and we're starting to see segregation down in the South, during this time period. Horizontal integration, I mentioned it, I'll mention it again. Horizontal integration was when one company controlled all aspects of one part of production. I'm going to apologize again tonight, guys, with all the buffering. I don't know what is going on. And then the great question, Lizzie, the parts of the world that the immigrants come from. During time period 4, it's referred to as the old wave of immigrants, and most of those immigrants are coming from Western Europe. Ireland, Scotland, Germany, England, those places. When we move into the Gilded Age, time period 6, you're going to see a shift of immigration now as they're going to start coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. And that's when you're going to see them coming from Russia, from Ukraine, from Czech Republic, places like that. Okay, from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, those areas. So old immigrants, Western Europe, new immigrants, Eastern and Southern Europe. Okay. Um, the court cases, I've already touched on a number of these. I'm going to go through them one more time. You need to know Marbury v. Madison. You need to know McCulloch versus Maryland. You need to know Gibbons v. Ogden. I would know Worcester versus Georgia. I would know the Dred Scott case. I would know Plessy v. Ferguson, Brown v. Board of Education, and, maybe Roe v. Wade. Those are the ones you need to know, okay? And honestly, if they're going to ask you questions about court cases, if they give you a stimulus, a lot of times it will be like a dissenting view or a supporting view of a decision. If you don't know, they're going to use the major cases. I just don't see them pulling out these little known cases like E.C. Knight versus the Poultry Company of Kansas or whatever that was, or Lochner versus New York. I mean, those cases, we study them, but they're not actually listed in the CED. So the ones in the CED are like the ones I just said, and so if you know those are what I would focus on. Okay. All right. The last thing I want to talk about from time period 6, and I just had it. I did the New South. I did that. I'm trying to think. I think I hit everything from period 6. Oh, Native Americans. I have not talked about Native Americans for a bit. During time period 6, you're also this is the time period when you're going to see the end of the frontier. As the westward expansion is going, the further west we go, like I said earlier tonight, as we expand, you're going to have more and more conflict with the Native Americans. Between 1865 and 1890, you're going to see a series of Plains Indian Wars. And these are wars that are going to be fought in the western frontier. And during this time, it's primarily the Plains Indians, so like the Lakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Shoshone. They're going to be fighting against the United States military, trying to hold on to their land. Now, you're going to see a reservation system put in play under the Fort Laramie Treaty, but the Dawes Act is going to be passed in 1887, and what the Dawes Act is going to do is it's going to break up the reservations. It's going to give lands to the Native Americans, but in acreage to individual families. And what that's going to do is they're going to ask the Native Americans, you're going to have to assimilate to our culture. You're going to have to start farming our way. And you're also going to see them start things like the Native American boarding schools and stuff like that, all with the intent of trying to assimilate the Native American other stuff. So you might make sure you know about the Native Americans during this time period as well. Time period 6, I think I hit a lot of it. Oh, no, I did not. Politics. We got to talk about the rise of the Populist Party during the 1890s. During this time period, the farmers are kind of the forgotten men during this time. And they're going to go through a growth of organization that starts with local grange organizations that then grows into the Farmers Alliance. Now, the reason why they start to come together is so they can basically bring all their resources together to try to get like the best prices to buy grain, to get the best prices to ship their goods, and and to have a voice, if you will, because numbers equals a louder voice, and that's what they're trying to do. And so as they turn into the Farmers Alliance, you're going to start seeing more of a political sway away from they sway a little bit more away from the economics of farming to the politics of trying to get the best for the farmers. And so you're going to see the Farmers Alliance start to form. The Farmers Alliance is going to then merge and become what's known as the Populist Party. The Populist Party, or the People's Party, actually was just around for one presidential election, but they're going to introduce what's called the Omaha Platform. And the Omaha Platform is going to introduce a lot of political ideas like the direct election of senators, getting rid of secret ballots. They want bimetallism during this time period. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to politically make change to economically help themselves. And that's what bimetallism was all about. It was coining both gold and silver. Now, oh no, I smell a skunk and my dogs are outside. Just hope for the best. It's not going to be good. So anyway, that bimetallism is going to it's going to be defeated, but what we see is the populace, some of their ideas are going to carry us into the next time period. And when that happens, you're going to see a lot of their ideas come to fruition and become law. I am going to take a 5-minute break because I think my dog might have just gotten messed with a skunk. So hang on just a second and come up with questions, and I'll come back and I'll answer them all. So hold tight. I'll be right back. Hey, they didn't get sprayed. Woo! I was scared for a minute. There's a skunk out there. I saw it, but he just did a warning spray, and my dogs were fortunate enough to not be close. So, boy, what a night. Streaming problems and now skunk problems. And skunks are cute from a distance. From a distance. Not close to my dogs. Okay, so we just wrapped up time period 6. Does anybody have any questions about time periods? I did dodge a big bullet. Let's see. If the DBQ is about civil rights, what do you recommend we talk about in the contextualization? It depends on the years. So if they're talking about the civil rights movement of the 1950s, I would probably talk about, say, and this is just a shot in the dark, but let's say they ask about the civil rights movement from the 1950s to the 1970s. What I would talk about in contextualization is maybe stuff like the Double V program during the World War II, people like Jackie Robinson, maybe the NAACP and their contribution to civil rights. I mean, they took a legal standpoint, and they tried to fight civil rights through the courts. The other thing I would also talk about is maybe Jim Crow in the South. That was has been in existence since 1877. So those are the different types of things that I might talk about during in my contextualization before I actually started when it went into the civil rights of 1950s. Now, if it's talking about the civil rights in the earlier times, you might have to go back to during Reconstruction and use some of that. I would be very careful. If it's a civil rights question, I would bet it's going to be in more modern times, so the 50s through 70s. So I would use Jim Crow and some of the earlier civil rights. Maybe Booker T. Washington, maybe like I said, Truman desegregating the army, stuff like that. Those are the things I would throw in there. It still smells like a skunk in here, but they didn't get sprayed. I think it's just the smell from around here. Okay. I talked briefly about time period 7 when I talked about FDR. Yeah, that's a great reminder. Yeah, I think here's the thing. When you're doing context, I agree with Mr. Rios. You want to give information and don't be and describe what you're talking about. When you're giving context, you also don't want to go too far. Context should be 3 to 5 sentences, 2 to 3 pieces of evidence that just sets the stage. That's all context is. You're not giving them the entire history of the civil rights movement. You're just setting the stage and talking about what got us to this point right now. And so, I would also, if I was doing the civil rights in 1950, maybe I wouldn't talk Jim Crow. Maybe I'd just talk about how during World War II, our African Americans fought in Europe, and they fought using what was called the Double V program, that they didn't want just victory in Europe, they wanted victory in America too. So they brought that idea of victory home with them. And they had people like, Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball, and then and that's going to take us into the 1950s, and that leads to these movements. So that's what I was kind of you're just setting the stage. I always tell people that contextualization is like that little start to a TV show that says previously on this show, and it just gives you a couple clips so you can understand what's going on before you get into the main story of that episode. So it's a balance. It's definitely a balance, but you don't want to write contextualization, because remember, you only get 1 point for contextualization. That's it. And there on the DBQ, there are 6 more points available. And if you spend all your time just to get that 1 point, you're throwing away those other points. So be brief, be concise, be very specific about what you write, but make sure what you're writing is connecting to what your essay is about. Don't write about the expansion of slavery in the 1800s if you're writing about civil rights in the 1900s. You can make a connection by a whole bunch of links, but it's not a direct connection, if that makes sense. So that's what you have to be careful. I got dog hair on my face. I'm sorry. Okay, so there we go. As we go into time period 7, we're talking about civil rights. That was a big part of time period 7, was the rise of the civil rights movement. But really, when we talk about time period 7, it starts with imperialism. With imperialism, after the frontier closed at the end of the Gilded Age, America didn't have anywhere else to expand. But we had a lot of stuff. Because of industrialization, we needed to find new markets. And so we are going to start looking out into the world. I always say we weren't trying to imperialize to control countries. We were trying to imperialize to control markets. We wanted to expand our markets into the world. That's why we fought in the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War basically brings in new territories for the United States, specifically the Philippines and Guam, but it gives us a protectorate status over Cuba. And what we've really done is within the Caribbean, Cuba, and Latin America and stuff, we're expanding our markets into those areas. And that's kind of how we were imperializing. And that's what this time period was, how it started. But what we often associate time period 7 with is the world wars. And I'm going to be honest with you guys right now, you're not going to see a lot of questions about the wars, specifically about battles and stuff like that. You might see, time periods that talk about the wars and everything, but generally, when you look at this exam, they have questions, or the questions they ask are about the effects of the war and stuff like that. But World War I was the first major venture we went into with regards to America getting involved on a global scale. And we tried to stay out of World War I for as long as we could. But what pulled us into World War I was our markets were affected. Our ships were being attacked by the unrestricted submarine warfare of the Germans. And if we can't trade, then that affects our economy directly. Now, there was also the Zimmerman telegram, which was insulting to us. But once Germany said we're going to go back to unrestricted submarine warfare and we're going to blow up any ship that crosses the Atlantic, we really didn't have a choice. And that's where what's his name? Woodrow Wilson is going to ask for a declaration of war. And he's going to go and ask for a declaration of war based on the idea that he said we want to make the world safe for democracy. And what we wanted to do, and that's true, we wanted to make the world safe for democracy, but we also wanted to make the world safe for trade. And if you look at, when you look at his 14 points, because he's going to that's his plan for world peace coming out of the war. His 14 points include freedom of the seas, which is the freedom of trade vessels to go wherever they need to if they're under a neutral flag. The war comes to an end. The Allies win, surprise, surprise. And the big thing that's going to happen there is Woodrow Wilson is going to introduce at the Treaty of Versailles talks his 14 points. And one of the major points he introduces is the establishment of a League of Nations. Well, what America does after World War I is they return back to isolationism. They go back to that idea of neutrality. They go back to that idea of let's just stay on our side of the world. And so we refuse to join the League of Nations. Leave me alone. You stink. Yeah. Um, and when that happens, we kind of go back to our own way and we enter into the 1920s. Now, the 1920s are going to be spurred, number one, by the end of the war. We're happy about that. We're going to see an economic boom in the 1920s. The return to normalcy campaign is going to be Warren G. Harding, and he's going to launch that campaign in the election of 1920. So he's going to come in. But if you remember correctly, when Harding gets elected, he's going to have a little bit of controversy in his presidency. He's going to have some of his friends who don't do the best things and stuff like that. But he is going to die in office, and he'll be replaced by Calvin Coolidge. The first Red Scare, also happens in the 1920s. That's a result of still all of these of socialism. Now, the first Red Scare is going to be spurred during World War I. You're going to have the revolution, the Russian Revolution over in the Soviet Union is going to be established. And there is a fear, because those are the socialist ideas that led to the Russian Revolution. We're worried that those ideas are going to come over here to the United States, because we have all these people immigrating from Russia coming into our country. And so that's going to spur the Red Scare. And we do have anarchists in our country at this time. We do have people who are launching some attacks against government officials and sending bombs through the mail and stuff like that, which leads to the Palmer raids. So that's what's going to be driving that first Red Scare, is this fear of socialism and the ideas of socialism coming into our country and possibly leading to a revolution here, like was experienced over in Russia in 1917. So that's what drives that. That's why we passed like the National Origins Act and the Emergency Quota Act to try to limit the number of immigrants coming in the 1920s. So that's what's going on. But we were fearful, but we were also kind of having a good time, because we enter into this time period of an economic boom. We enter into this time period of consumerism, where Americans are buying all this cool new stuff. We are living under prohibition during this time, but we're still kind of having a really good time. But there's still inequality during this time. We still have a lot of segregation in the South. Because of that segregation during World War I, you're going to see, and Jim Crow during World War I, you're going to see a lot of African Americans start to move to the North in the Great Migration. And the Great Migration, what this is this huge movement of African Americans to the northern cities. And one effect of that migration is going to be what's called the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance basically, and so the 1920s are going to usher us into the Great Depression. The Great Depression is going to be caused by a number of causes, such as speculation, poor banking practices, but it's going to be the crash of the stock market in October of 1929 that is going to signal the start of the Great Depression, probably the worst economic crisis that we've had in our country. Now, I talked about FDR and the New Deal earlier. I'll just touch on it briefly here. Hoover is not going to have an answer to the Great Depression. He's just going to follow suit of other former presidents during economic panics who, during laissez-faire, they just let the economy come back, and we relied on rugged individualism, and we're just going to fight our way through it, and we would get through it. But during this one, it was a lot worse. So FDR is going to come in, and this is where we're going to see a lot of government intervention into the economy. And someone mentioned that earlier. And we're going to see the New Deal is going to be introduced with the 3 R's, the relief, recovery, and reform, which is going to try to usher us through the Great Depression. It didn't really get us through. It got us to the point where we entered into World War II. And once we entered into World War II, wartime production, factory production is going to amp up, and that's going to be what pulls us out of the Great Depression. And we go and fight World War II. We tried to stay out of it for a while. We tried to stay neutral. We tried to pass neutrality acts. We passed the Lend-Lease Act. We had cash and carry. But in the end, it's going to be the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, where we finally enter the war. It's going to be a two-front war that we're going to fight. We're going to fight in Europe, and we're going to fight in the Pacific. The Allied powers are going to be led by the Big Three, which are FDR from the United States, Winston Churchill from Great Britain, and Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union. And we are going to fight against the Axis powers, which was Germany, Japan, and Italy, amongst others. So eventually we put all our, we're fighting a two-front war, but we decide that we're going to fight in Europe first, because if we take Europe and we win that, then we had the promise from Stalin that he would help us take down Japan and he would help us in the Pacific. So a lot of our forces are focused on Europe. Couple things you need to know. You got to know D-Day, June 6, 1944. That's the American or the Allied invasion of Normandy. This is going to be the beginning of the end for the Axis powers, because once we take France back, we're just pushing back against Germany. We're pushing them back, and Russia is pushing from the other side. So it's the beginning of the end for German control in Europe, and Hitler's going to be defeated. VE Day, Victory in Europe, is going to be in June of 1945. Unfortunately, FDR dies in April of 1945. So at the end of the war, Harry Truman is now our president. Okay. You don't, I mean, battles from the war, like I said, you need to know the Normandy, you need to know the D-Day invasion. I would know Iwo Jima. That's a good one to know from the war in the Pacific. And also know how the war ended. And that's going to be the use of the first atomic bomb. And Truman is going to decide to drop the bomb over Hiroshima, and then he'll drop a second one over Nagasaki. That's going to lead to the surrender of Japan and the end of the war. But it's also going to launch us into the Cold War. And that's in time period 8. So that's where we are right now. We're getting ready to go into time period 8. We are going up on 2.5 hours right now, so it's getting late, isn't it? What were some of the domestic policies carried out during World War II? Your friend Emily is really lost. Wyatt, we got to help her out. So domestic policies during World War II, basically what we're talking about is the total war mentality. We're going to mobilize our entire society towards fighting this war. So you are going to have the policy, you're going to have the rationing going on during this time. Women are going to be working in the factories. The Rosie the Riveter is the example. She's like the image of women working in the factories. People are going to be asked to plant victory gardens during this time. People are going to be asked to conserve, to buy bonds, to help fund the war. Everything during the war is going to be focused on, winning the war. The Bracero program, that's definitely, that's going to be what that was. And God, Mr. Rios, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm getting a little loopy. But the Bracero program was basically, we opened up the border with Mexico to allow Mexican workers to come into America to work agricultural industries, so we could have more men fighting the wars. And so we allowed Mexicans to come in, to immigrate in. They worked our agricultural products so we could keep our farms going while our soldiers were fighting over in the war. So I believe that was it. But you also, we talked about civil rights earlier. African Americans were allowed to fight in this war. They fought in segregated units, though, so keep that in mind. And the people you need to know the Tuskegee Airmen, an incredible fighting force during World War II. Doris Miller won the Naval Cross during the Battle of Pearl Harbor. So know a couple of those names, but African Americans, Mexican Americans, they all contributed to the war effort. Probably one of the biggest domestic policies that you need to know from World War II is going to be Executive Order 9066, the internment of Japanese American citizens. There was a fear that the Japanese Americans were a threat to our national security. So FDR is going to use that as justification to move them all from their homes and put them in internment camps throughout the western part of the United States throughout the entirety of the war. And literally they lost everything during that time. So, Wyatt, I don't know if that helps your friend Emily, but if you have other questions, I am happy to answer those with regards to World War II. Any other questions about this time period before I move on to time period 8? Silence. Okay, time period 8 starts in 1945, goes all the way to 1980. 1945 marks the beginning of the Cold War. 1980 marks the election of Ronald Reagan. The Cold War, you got to remember the C's. The Cold War during this time was about containment. It was about consumerism. It was, I'm drawing a blank on the C's. The civil rights movement during this time. So let's talk Cold War first. Let's talk about the what we're trying to do, because what's happening during time period 8 is we're entering in. We are now using that nuclear bomb. We become a global superpower. And we are one of 2 global superpowers in the 1945 going into the 1950s and on. The other superpower is the Soviet Union, our former ally from World War II. We are worried that the Soviet Union is trying to spread communism throughout the world. They are worried that we're trying to spread democracy throughout the world. So we are in conflict with one another, and that's the basis of the Cold War during this time period. Now, we didn't want to take down the Soviet Union, but we didn't want them to influence the world. So we are going to start practicing what is called containment. Now, first of all, what you have to understand is following World War II, we are going to... I don't quite understand that. What we're going to do is what do you mean by that? How did World War II change Americans' origin policy? What are you actually asking me there? And then I'll go ahead and answer that. I'll circle back around. But let me explain it. At the end of World War II, what the Allied powers did was we divided up Germany. We didn't want another... Thank you, Don. We didn't want another Treaty of Versailles situation like we had after World War I. So we're going to divide up Germany into 4 zones. The Soviets are going to take a zone, we're going to take a zone, the British are going to take a zone, and the French are going to take a zone. And what we're going to do is we're going to assist them in rebuilding after the war, and then eventually allow them to have elections and then return, their independence back to them. But the idea of them being democratic, a democratic nation. Well, the Soviets didn't really like that, because what the Soviets wanted coming out of World War II was they wanted a buffer. They wanted a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. And so that's when the Soviets start occupying all these different nations that had once been occupied by Germany. It became known as the Soviet bloc, and Winston Churchill said as the Soviets took over all that territory, they essentially dropped an iron curtain across all of Europe. And that iron curtain represents a division between capitalism and communism, or democracy and socialism, and the Soviet Union had basically taken control of all of Eastern Europe. They also took control of Berlin. Berlin had been divided up as well. The capital of Germany had been divided up into 4 zones, and what the Soviets tried to do was blockade. They set up a blockade around Berlin, and with the hopes of gaining control of that. And they hoped that what would happen was that they would essentially starve the West Berliners into submission. That's going to be curtailed by by Truman, though, with the Berlin airlift. We're going to drop, millions of pounds of food in there for 11 months and essentially break the blockade. I mentioned the blockade because of this. Do not confuse the Berlin blockade with the Berlin Wall. The blockade was a temporary situation that we defeated with the Berlin airlift. The Berlin Wall is an actual physical division between East and West Berlin that was built by the Soviets in the 1960s. Okay? I'm going to circle back to time period 7 because there's a question, what was the Teapot Dome scandal? Essentially, the Teapot Dome scandal happened during the presidency of Warren G. Harding. It was when his Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, who controlled all the oil leases. You had all this public land owned by the government, and there was oil on that land. And what they would do is they would lease out oil to different companies. And what happened was Albert Fall started leasing that land out, or giving that land out, by taking bribes. So oil companies would approach him and say, hey, listen, I know we're not supposed to be drilling here, but here's some money, we're going to start drilling there. Well, where it happened was there's a location in Wyoming called the Teapot Dome area, and there's a rock formation that looks like a teapot, and it was rich in oil, and he opened that area up for drilling, and he took a bribe to do it, which was illegal, and so he's going to end up going to jail. It makes Harding look bad. Harding was not responsible for any of that. He was just basically basically, he surrounded himself with the wrong people. So that's what that scandal was all about. It was about oil. Um, Thank you, Don. Yeah, exactly. The wall went up in 1960. So the English, the Americans, and the French, we returned West Germany to the German people, but the Soviets never do. They keep East Germany as part of the Soviet bloc, and so these are the lines being drawn during the Cold War. We don't want communism spreading any further than where it already exists. So we're going to start practicing containment. And what containment is basically we said we're going to go wherever we need to in the world to stop the spread of communism. We'll give financial help, we'll give military help, we'll give whatever help we can to stop the spread. And that was first laid out in the Truman Doctrine. And that was focused primarily on Greece and Turkey because there was a civil war rising there, and those two countries were at risk of falling under communism. So Truman's going to send over money and military help to prevent the rise of communism there. But it wasn't just about military help, it was also about financial help. Europe was decimated by this war, and we believe that in poverty, communism grows. So what's going to happen is the Secretary of State, George Marshall, is going to travel to Europe and say, this is awful. These people they can't get bread, they don't have a place to live. So he's going to suggest, and we're going to implement the Marshall Plan, where we're going to invest billions of dollars in Europe to allow them to start rebuilding. And at the same time, while they're rebuilding, that will keep the lure of communism from coming in and trying to take control. So both of these actions were taken in the late 1940s to stop the spread of communism. But we're going to see that continue throughout this entirety of the Cold War. You're going to see it during Eisenhower's presidency with the Eisenhower Doctrine. You're going to see it with Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're trying to, the communists and the Cuba, they allied together, and we're trying to keep the missiles out of Cuba. So, we're going to set up a quarantine line, a blockade around, and we come very close to nuclear war. But eventually, the Soviets agree to pull their missiles out of Cuba, and we agree to pull our missiles out of Turkey, and that crisis comes to an end. But it's constantly about containing. And during this time, we're actually going to fight in some proxy wars over the spread of communism. That's what Korea, that's what Vietnam are all about, is to prevent the spread of communism into those nations. Korea, we were successful. We fought to a stalemate, and, Korea is still divided today between North and South Korea, but we did stop it from spreading into South Korea. Vietnam did not, we fought to a stalemate, but as soon as we left Vietnam, we're going to see the South Vietnam fall to communist control when the North Vietnamese come in and take over. So everything, like I said, we're doing during this Cold War is to fight against the spread of communism. You're going to see the formation of NATO during this time period. You're going to see the formation of the Warsaw Pact in reaction to NATO. So we're going to see alliances starting to be built and starting to be created in the world. And like I said, NATO still exists today. I did drive past the Teapot Dome, and if you look at it from a distance, it actually does look like a teapot. So the bonus army. The bonus army is going to be come out of World War I during the Great Depression. These are veterans who fought in World War I and were promised a bonus. Now, this bonus wasn't going to come payable until like 1945. But then the Great Depression hit, and they said the money would be better spent now. We need the money now. So the bonus army is going to march to Washington, and they're going to protest. And they're protesting for the passage of legislation that would pay them their bonus early. What's going to end up happening is they're going to build like a Hooverville, if you will, on the Capitol grounds. And Hoover is going to send out the troops to break up the bonus army, to break up where they're living there, and a fire is going to break out, and an infant's going to die, and everything, and then the legislation's not going to pass. But that's what it was all about. It was World War I veterans trying to get paid their bonus early during the Great Depression. Okay, so I talked about containment. The 1950s is very similar to the 1920s. A large rise of consumerism, conformity during this time. I see your question, Alfred. I'll get right to it. And it's just the growth of an American culture during this time. And of course, you got to talk about the baby boom during time period 8. We're going to see over 60 million babies born during this time, which is great for us in the 70s and 80s. It's really going to come to start biting us back in the late 90s, and even today we're really struggling because of the baby boom. Alfred says, is the 8th unit the most civil rights movement heavy, or is there more okay, it's both. You have the huge civil rights movement during the 1950s, 1960s. Remember, that's what we did the civil rights case study on, that leads to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But it's also the containment, anti-communist movement. So Alfred, both of these things are happening at the exact same time. So Unit 8 covers both of those. The Truman Doctrine and the domino theory actually, yes, fall together. Because we want to go into these different all the questions are coming, which is good. We go in to stop the spread of communism because we feel if we don't stop it in one country, it will easily spread to the next country, and that domino theory will step in. That's why we went to Korea. That's why we went to Vietnam, and so that's that you're exactly right. The domino theory plays a huge role in all of this. Unit 8 is when the Cold War begins. Yes, Bella, that is correct. Can you annotate an LEQ or DBQ? You're doing it on the computer. You are able to take notes on there. You can highlight and stuff like that. You can't physically annotate. But what you can do is you can use scratch paper and take notes on that scratch paper. So even though you can't actually write on the documents like you would if you had a hard copy, there are some tools that you can do in there. I already talked about the Bracero program. I can try to circle back around a little bit later. The Zoot Suit riots was during the World War II. It happened in California. Zoot suits was a fashion trend of Mexican Americans during that time. And what's going to happen is you're going to have a standoff or a fight or a riot between white American soldiers and Mexican Americans, angry about the war, angry about the fact of who was fighting and who wasn't, and that's going to lead to these riots during this time. Thank you, yeah, Don. They do get, but on the scheduled year, 1945, absolutely, they do get their money. Can you bring a mouse? You can bring your own mouse to the exam. Yes, you absolutely can do that. When you write your thesis statement, you don't necessarily have to put specific evidence in there. You should more of a topic. So if you're like going to use amendments, you're going to say, and I don't even just use as an example, one way the government changed during Reconstruction was the introduction of new amendments. You don't have to list those amendments there. You're going to list those in your body paragraph. So that's one of your topics. So you don't have to list evidence with your topics, because that will come later. But make sure your topics are clear enough that they know. Don't just say political and economic and social. Say political changes like new amendments, or social changes like Jim Crow, that kind of stuff. All right? I hope that answers your question. Nothing from being specific. I'd say, yeah, it's not. There you go. We did not go back to isolationism during Vietnamization. No, it was just the opposite. Vietnamization, what that was Nixon's plan to start pulling U.S. troops out of Vietnam, while at the same time training and elevating the South Vietnam government and army to be able to stand on their own. But we're not going to go back to isolationism, because when you have Nixon, his foreign policy, he is going to introduce détente. That's his foreign policy. And détente, what that was, is a cooling off of the relationship between us and China. He's actually going to go into China and visit China and actually, talk about possible economic agreements later. He's going to take part in the SALT I talks, where he and Khrushchev are going to negotiate reducing the amount of weapons that we're producing. So we never go back to isolationism, because by this point in time, we're one of the leading powers on the global political stage. So there is no opportunity to go back to isolationism at this point. Did Johnson pardon the southern states that seceded, or did he issued a blanket pardon? he did issue a blanket pardon except for Confederate leaders. And the leaders had to come and apply for that pardon directly. But he did issue a blanket pardon to like all the soldiers and stuff like that. Okay? Good questions coming across here. Make sure the civil rights movement, which president was involved with the SALT talks? That's going to be Nixon. And then later you're going to have the SALT II talks with Carter. Nixon's talks were successful. Carter's talks were not. I mean, that's a simplification, but that's essentially what happened. Civil rights, make sure you have a good working knowledge of the civil rights movement of the 1950s. Brown v. Board of Education, that Supreme Court case in 1954 is very important. Sorry, I got something in my eye. And what that's going to do is that's going to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. So it's going to desegregate the public schools, and we're going to put us on the path of desegregation. But it also amplifies the civil rights movement of 1950s. This is where you're going to see the Montgomery bus boycotts get started, led by Martin Luther King Jr. You're going to see other boycotts start to grow. You're going to see the civil rights movement start to grow during this time. So watch all that, and all of the civil rights movement is moving towards the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So then, once we get into the 1960s, things, that's when we're in Vietnam. The Vietnam War, we started off in the early 60s as advisors. We're going to send our first troops in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution under President Johnson. By 1968, the number of our troops reaches its peak at over 500,000 troops. And that's, there's protests against the Vietnam War early, but not to the extent that we see from 68 on. That's when you're really going to see the elevation of protests against the war. 68 is a turning point year. That it's in 1968 that the Tet Offensive happens. It's in 1968 because of the Tet Offensive we learned that we're not winning this war, and we learned that our leaders have been lying to us about it. And so the credibility gap is going to be a thing at this point. The gap between us and our leaders, where we start to distrust them. 68 is when Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. are both assassinated. And 68 is going to be the election year for Richard Nixon. McKinley's presidency is at the turn of the century. That's the early 1900s. His foreign policy, that's when we started to go into imperialism. It was under McKinley that we fought the Spanish-American War. He is going to be assassinated during his second term, and that's going to lead to Teddy Roosevelt becoming president. And during Teddy Roosevelt's policy, he's going to have his big stick diplomacy, in which we become the overseer of the Western Hemisphere. Okay? So that's McKinley. And as we go into Teddy Roosevelt's administration, we're going into the progressive era. Under Teddy Roosevelt, you're going to see things like the Meat Inspection Act passed, and the Pure Food and Drug Act passed, and the Sherman Antitrust Act was in the 1890s, but the Clayton Antitrust Act will be passed during this time as well. Okay? All right, so that's where we're at here so far. This is a great place if you have any questions to start pouring them on, because Lennox is getting tired, and I'm getting a little loopy. So if you give me some direction, I will take that direction and I will run with it. But I need some questions, because we're coming up on 10 o'clock, 3 hours, and I want to know what you want to know. Mobilization. When we talk about mobilization, I'm assuming that you're talking about mobilization during the World Wars. And when we talk about that, what we're referring to is that the citizens, those who were not fighting, were expected to contribute to the war effort. The more we had, the better. So people were asked to plant victory gardens. Women were working in the factories. Kids were collecting scrap metal. We were asked to ration the food. We were asked to conserve energy, to conserve everything. Everything we did on a day-to-day basis was tied to this idea that we're going to help the war effort. And that's what total mobilization of society meant. And we had the propaganda machines going, talking about buying bonds and volunteering and planting gardens and not buying foods on the black market, but using your rationing stamps and stuff like that. when we look at the political party changes, I mean, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but simply we start with the Democrat, Republicans, and the Federalists. And if you look at the political parties, the names change, but really the ideas and the platforms are very similar. The Federalists believed in a strong central government, and the Democrat Republicans believed in more power to the states. What happens as we go into the 18 teens, we're going to see the Federalist Party die off. We're going to go into a single party system of just the Democratic Republicans. As we move into the 1920s, you're going to see the Democratic Republicans split, and you're going to have the Jacksonian Democrats, and then you're going to have the Whig Party. Now, as we move into the 1850s and the debate over slavery starts to become more prevalent, the Whig Party is going to lose some of its power, and you're going to see the rise of the Free Soilers. But the Democrats are also going to split because you're going to have the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. What's going to happen in the mid-1850s is the Whigs, the Free Soilers, and the Northern Democrats are going to come together and form the Republican Party. So now we have the Republicans and the Democrats moving forward. And what you're going to see is during this time, as we go past the Civil War into the 1900s, typically you saw voting blocks in our country. So you saw the southern states at this point after the Civil War, they had always before the Civil War been voting Democrat. After the Civil War, more Republican, which makes sense because you have the African Americans voting. And so traditionally they're going to vote Republican. And, you're also, but then as we start to move into the 1950s and you start to move into, into Jim Crow in that area, you're going to see the voting block of the African Americans shift, and they're going to start voting Democrat. So for a while, you're going to see more Democrats voting a voting block in the South, and you're going to see Republicans in the more higher, the urban centers and stuff like that. During the 1968 election, you're going to see Nixon's Southern strategy, where he's going to try to appeal to those people who were not necessarily happy with the Civil Rights Act and stuff like that. And he is going to essentially flip the electorate in the South back to Republican. But the parties themselves, by the 1860s, going into the 1870s, we have Democrats and Republicans. There'll be a little bit of fluctuation throughout the time, but those are pretty close to similar to the parties that parties don't tend to do as well in elections. But that's essentially a really quick overview of the evolution of political parties. I'm going to circle back to the LEQ and DBQ. The Whig Party was essentially, when you look at the Whig Party, they believed, again, in a strong central government. They believed in an economic system based on industry. They believed in the American system, stuff like that. That's where the Whig Party came from. John Adams was the second president of the United States, and his significance was basically he helped write the Declaration of Independence. He was there during the Continental Congress. What do you want to know? The Alien and Sedition Act, the XYZ affair. So, the second president, pretty significant. Whig Party, yeah, there you go. Thank you, Alicia. Gettysburg Address. What was significant about it was during the Gettysburg Address that Lincoln, I think, he's memorializing everyone who died on the battlefield, but he's also laying, very brief groundwork for the nation coming back together. That's where he was always about reunifying the nation. So that's where he starts talking about, honestly, forgiveness and coming back together. Who was he? It was Lincoln who gave that address. Okay, he was the president. There's 55 multiple choice questions. You have 55 multiple choice questions and 55 minutes to get those done. Probably just a typo on your teacher's paper. So sorry about that. I'll apologize for your teacher. LEQ, DBQ, how to write it. I can't give you an entire writing structure. Hopefully you are familiar with the rubric. Both of these, contextualization and thesis are probably the first two easiest points you can get. Both of them, when you write contextualization, that's 3 to 5 sentences, just giving a little bit of background to understand what you're going to write about. And then you write your thesis statement where you make your argument. Be specific with your thesis. Don't say political, economic, social, but give specific topics in both of those. When you write your LEQ, the core parts, the body parts, Your LEQ, you're going to write like you write SAQs. And I don't know what you've learned, but I teach T, which is topic, sentence, evidence, and analysis. So that is the core of your body paragraphs, and you do that for each piece of evidence. Now, the DBQ, I teach my students to SPY. Summarize the document, explain how the document answers the prompt, and then why was the document written. If you use HIP, and a lot of teachers do, it's the same idea. Summarize the document, explain why it was written, and then, use one of those HIP statements. But you do that for each and every document. So for my students, I tell them to SPY each document. And if you SPY each document, you'll be fine. You'll hit all the points required by the rubric. So that's pretty much like the structure of it. I hope that helps. If you have a specific question, drop it in here. Okay. You're asking a lot of questions. George Washington farewell address. Henry Clay, these are big names that you should know. I'm going to be honest with you, and if you're asking me, if you don't know these things right now, you need to really dig in and start some studying. I'm being totally transparent. George Washington's farewell address was where he set the principle for countries to remain for our country to remain neutral, for our country to avoid political parties, as well as for our to avoid debt. The big thing, he wanted warning against political parties. Okay, Henry Clay was a politician, a second generation politician. He's also known as the Great Compromiser. He's going to introduce the Missouri Compromise. He's going to introduce the American system. He is going to help with the Compromise of 1850. He runs for president in 1824. He loses. He's going to be the secretary, or he will serve as Secretary of State, I believe, under John Quincy Adams, but he was very influential in Congress during the 18 teens all the way up until through the 1840s, okay? Okay, I have no idea what that quit. What is the chomper rice of APUSH? First of all, maybe help me understand what that means, because I'm old and I know 6'7", but that I don't know. So help me out with that one, and I'll be happy to tell you what my opinion is on that. All right, now we're just in the point now. It's just up to you guys. It's just questions, and I'll stay here as long as you ask me questions, and then we're going to move on. So what do we got here, guys? Throw them at me. Lennox is here. I think Don Rios is still on the side helping me out. I don't know if Miss Pahovich is still in there or not, but we're here for you. It's 10 o'clock. It's T-minus 10 hours before the exam. What do you need to know? 55, yes. 55 multiple choice questions. Yes, ma'am. What else? This is 3 hours. Not bad. Not bad, not bad, not bad. Didn't even check to see if I had any text messages. No. Civil rights movement, important evidences. When we talk about the civil rights movement, what I want you to know, you got to know Brown v. Board of Education. You got to know that one. You need to know that Supreme Court case. I would be familiar with the Montgomery bus boycott. I would be from that was inspired by Rosa Parks. Alicia, your teacher is, I don't know what road she's leading you down, but it's 55 multiple choice questions with 55 minutes. I'm sorry about that. Back to civil rights, to the Montgomery bus boycott. Obviously, Martin Luther King Jr. and his role. You might want to be familiar with the Greensboro Four, the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides were the work of, they rode interstate buses to try to desegregate the bus stations, the bus terminals. When we get into the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then you're going to see the counterculture movement within the civil rights movement when you see the rise of SNCC and SNCC, the Black Panther Party, and Malcolm X. These are some of the names and stuff that you should know for the civil rights. That's what you can write about and stuff like that. The LEQ is T and the DBQ is SPY. Absolutely. That's exactly it, Abby. Okay. I've made a DBQ prediction. I still think it's going to come from time period 3. I think it's going to be about the road to the American Revolution. That's just my guess, but I could be wrong. Okay, I understand what you're saying. So what you have, Alicia, is you have 100 minutes to do both the LEQ and the DBQ. And if your teacher's telling you 65 minutes for the DBQ, that's a good number. What I teach and what I really recommend you do is, and I repeated it and I'll repeat it again. Write those bullet points for contextualization, then write a couple bullet points for your evidence. So in like 5 minutes, you should be able to plan out your LEQ. Then I want you to go and start planning your DBQ. And if that takes 15 minutes, great. If it takes you 20 minutes, great. If it takes you 25 minutes, I'm really okay with that. But so let's say you spend the first 20 to 30 minutes planning both essays. As soon as you're done planning that DBQ, you go right into writing the DBQ. And since you haven't planned out, you can write it rather quickly. But let's say it takes you another 45 minutes or so to write your DBQ. That means you just spent 30 minutes planning, 45 minutes writing your DBQ, and you look up and you're like, oh my gosh, I only have 15 minutes left for my LEQ. But here's the thing. You've already planned your LEQ. You don't have to panic. You don't have to say, what am I going to write about? Because you've already decided what you're going to write about. And with 15 minutes, you can write context, you can write thesis, and you can write a full body paragraph with those 2 pieces of evidence that you need in there. So that's how I would tell you. So if your teacher's telling you to spend 65 minutes on your DBQ, there's nothing wrong with that. But don't panic. If you plan both of them out first, you're not so much burdened by the clock. I had a student years ago, and I told my students this today, and I'll tell you this. I had a student years ago who literally had 10 minutes left for her LEQ, but she planned it out. She was able to write the first paragraph, and the rubric was a little bit different then, and she wrote a half a paragraph about, with one piece of evidence. The young lady still ended up getting a 5 on the exam. So that's why planning your essays is so important, okay? Let's see. I got some questions that came up. Yeah, Martin, you're right, Lisa. Martin Luther King believed that racism could be overcome. Malcolm X did not. And someone else said that Martin Luther King Jr., he was about peaceful protest, civil disobedience. Malcolm X is like, I wouldn't say, he was more violent. Absolutely. So, let's see. Do you think they will ask questions on the split republic? No. I wouldn't waste time on that. That would be great if you could throw that in an essay, but the mugwumps and the half-breeds, I don't even talk about those in class. So don't worry about that. Okay. All right. What else you got? I hope that made sense, Alicia and everybody else, when I explained about planning out your essays and what that looked like. So, still got 31 people here. What are you 31 people doing? Is there, this is about the time when I start to throw out this question. Is there anybody here who's not from my school or Mr. Rios' school? And if you're here, you know what schools those are. But, do anybody else from outside of San Antonio? Let's put it that way. Important court cases, I'll hit these a couple times. Yeah. Marbury v. Madison is probably the most a judicial review. McCulloch versus Maryland determines that the Supreme Court is I keep saying this. The McCulloch versus Maryland says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. You have Gibbons v. Ogden, which, sets the standard for the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, that the Congress has the authority to rule over interstate trade. I then jump ahead to Dred Scott v. Sanford, which ruled that slaves were property and could go anywhere in the country. Then we're going to jump ahead to Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson said separate but equal is the law of the land. That's going to be overturned by Brown v. Board of Education, which said separate is not equal. Those are the main cases that I would know. And I'll hit that one for you, Alicia, here in just a second. Oh, Massachusetts, cool. California, nice. I like it. let's see. You guys need to cram. Don't cram. Just review. Okay. DC. Should you go to bed? Well, Wyatt, let's see. Your test is in 7 hours. You want to get some sleep. If you're feeling confident, I would say you're good. Call it an evening. So here's the cool. Marbury v. Madison, Alicia. So this is the case in which you had John Adams who appointed the midnight judges. And when he appointed those midnight judges, they were supposed to get a confirmation letter. And one of those judges, and I'm drawing a blank on his name, but James Marbury, gosh, now you can tell I'm tired. His name is in the title. But Marbury did not get his appointment. And Madison and Jefferson refused to deliver it because they did not want to support another Federalist judge. So he is going to sue Madison, who was the Supreme Court Chief Justice, who was the Secretary of State. And in the case of Marbury v. Madison, John Marshall and the Supreme Court are going to rule that, you know what, Marbury probably should have gotten his appointment, but beyond that, the Judiciary Act of 1789 is actually unconstitutional because what Marbury wanted was a what was it called? A writ of mandamus to be applied to the Secretary of State, which means that he wanted the courts to order the executive branch what to do, and that wasn't constitutional. So that's the crux of the case. Marbury's going to end up losing because the Judiciary Act was ruled unconstitutional. But here's the bigger thing you need to remember. Marbury versus Madison set up the guideline that the Supreme Court is going to be the branch of government that rules on constitutionality of law, that they're going to interpret the law. So essentially, Marbury v. Madison set up the process of judicial review. And that's what I say over and over again, that Marbury v. Madison is judicial review, and judicial review is Marbury v. Madison. And if you just remember that, you'll be fine if it comes up on even if it comes up as a primary source. If you see Marbury v. Madison, I guarantee you. And if I'm wrong, you can hunt me down, or don't hunt me down, but you can yell at me online or something. But if it says Marbury v. Madison, you have what it is it's the answer is going to be judicial review. Do not worry about the Durr Rebellion. You don't need to know that. That's weeds. Don't waste your time with that. And at this point before the test, we're not going to waste our time with stuff that I guarantee you will not be on the test. Okay? All right, what else do we got? People from Florida and Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. I'm excited you're here. Are any of my students left? I always ask that one too. So, if you're my student, raise your hand. So, okay. Waiting for question. Oh, there we go. Abby's here. Do the different types of diplomacy at the start of 1900 influence foreign? Okay, okay. So you're talking about the diplomacy like of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. So you had big stick diplomacy, dollar diplomacy, and moral diplomacy. Yes and no. The influence of foreign policy after World War I, we're going to kind of return. We try to return back to the status quo. But you do have the influence of Wilson and stuff. But we still have our markets down in the Latin America. We're still trading and stuff like that. So the dollar diplomacy that was set up by Taft is still existence. I'm not going to go as far as saying that it influenced our policy going forward. It's just still existent at this point. After World War II, though, our foreign policy changes completely. That's where we step completely into the world and we don't look back, and we become an influence everywhere. Whereas those early 1900 policies were more of an influence in the Western Hemisphere. So I don't know if that answered your question directly, but that's kind of how I read it. Reaganomics. Ronaldomics. Reaganomics was Ronald Reagan's plan for the economy when he came in during the 1970s, where we were experiencing stagflation. And what Reaganomics said, it's also called trickle-down economics or supply-side economics. What he said is if we cut the taxes of the largest earners, of the corporations and stuff like that, they would be more likely to reinvest their money into their companies, thereby creating more jobs. So essentially it's called trickle down, because if I cut the taxes of the guys up here, they'll start spending money on their businesses. Their businesses will grow, producing more jobs, and that benefit will trickle down to people at the bottom, and they'll start making money that way. That was the idea behind it. He also is going to institute tax cuts across the board for everybody. So that's the bottom line of Reaganomics. The effects of Reconstruction 60 to 77. The amendments would absolutely be something I would use. The black codes or something. Yeah, I think that's your best plot. That's the path right there I would take. Exactly. The amendments in the black codes is perfect. I'm trying to think of anything else I might throw out there. I mean, you might want to throw things like, I mean, if you want another piece of evidence, carpetbaggers moving down south, the effect of that. But other than that, I think what you have there is really good. The process, okay, it wasn't Jefferson that went to get the Panama Canal. It's going to be Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt is going to go, this is during his time period, big stick diplomacy. And what he's trying to do is expand American influence throughout the Western Hemisphere. And so essentially what is going to happen is we wanted to build the canal. And it was Colombia that controlled Panama at that point. Panama was part of Colombia. Colombia would not deal with us. We encouraged the Panamanians to fight for their independence against Colombia. And in doing that, we did not get involved. But what we did do is we took our fleet, our naval vessel, because remember, Teddy Roosevelt and the Great White Fleet, we took our ships down into the area, not necessarily to get engaged with Colombia, but just to kind of be there as a big brother looking over Panama. And then when Panama won the revolution, they are going to go ahead and sign that lease that's going to bring the Panama Canal, or to get the Panama Canal built and give America control of that canal during that point. We'll have control of the canal until, 1999, where Bill Clinton actually negotiated the return of the canal to the Panamanian people, and it happened during that date. Let's see. Big stick diplomacy. Oh, wait. We get, let's see. Okay, big stick diplomacy, Bella. That was Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy, where he basically said that the United States was going to act as the intermediary between the Western Hemisphere and the rest of the world. So essentially, there was a situation where Germany had a problem with Venezuela. They owed them money or something like that. And basically, we paid off that debt to Germany, and now we told Venezuela, now you owe us. We're trying to maintain our control over the Western Hemisphere and our influence over the Western Hemisphere, and we tell the rest of the world that that's what we're doing over here. So they said, if you have a problem with countries over in the Western Hemisphere, come to the United States and we'll handle that problem for you. And Western Hemisphere countries, if you have a problem with other countries, come to us and we'll handle that for you. So the picture I think about is Teddy Roosevelt pulling his ships, which represent the Navy, and holding the big stick. And it's called big stick diplomacy. And I think of Roosevelt as kind of like the police commissioner of the Western Hemisphere. And he's not going to let any bad guys in, and he's not going to let any bad guys out as well. Okay, so hopefully that helps you. Let's see. Did the Great Depression influence our decision to expand its sphere of influence globally? No, it did not. We actually tried to stay out of it, because remember, it was during that time that you had the rise of fascism over in Europe, and we tried to stay out of that war for as long as we could. When we really stuck our foot into the pool of global influence, it's going to be during the Cold War. That's when we really get involved. Effects of the Spanish-American War. We got Cuba became a protectorate under the United States, which is going to tick off some of them. We got the Philippines as a territory, which led to the Philippine-American War. But then once that was settled, Philippines became one of our biggest allies. We got Guam, we got Puerto Rico. And America got territories throughout the world. So America basically stepped into the world, not necessarily as a major global power, but remember, what we were looking for was new markets that we could expand. Because during the Gilded Age, we had all that industry, so we had all this stuff we wanted to sell, so we wanted new markets to sell to. My DBQ prediction is time period 3. Sorry, Sam. You're not done for. It's just going to be about the American Revolution. You got this. The two panics, I'm not sure which panics you're talking about. The Panic of 37, 39, 73, 93, Panic of 1819. Basically, when we talk about economic panics, we're talking about economic crises in our country. And normally the way they occur is you have an over speculation. People are investing too much unsafely that, you have, I'm drawing a blank here. Farmers are going into crisis. Speculation is the biggest thing that lead to all these economic panics. Mr. Rios, if you could hop in there a little bit with me and help me with the panics, because I'm drawing a blank. But I know speculation on land, and overspending and banks collapsing. And then once a bank collapses, and in the early panics, there was no protection for banks if they collapsed. So if the bank closed, you lost all your money. If you lost all your money, then businesses couldn't stay open. If businesses can't stay open, then unemployment rises. As unemployment rises, it's just that you just get into the cyclical effect. So the panics, probably the biggest panic in the 1800s was the Panic of 1893, but 73 was pretty bad. The panics of 37 and 39, I think, are a direct reflection to the destruction of the National Bank from Andrew Jackson during his presidency. So those are kind of the things you're looking at. FRQ, I have no FRQ. I can't predict those at all because they're going to cover all of the time periods. I mean, it's bottom line. It's just whether they're going to be economic or political or social. I just have no idea. The events that led to the progressive movement and the cut of basically, my back. What we had leading into the progressive era was we had muckrakers, and they were exposing a lot of the corruption, a lot of the destruction of our society. And so that's going to push for a move of change in our society. For example, you're going to have Upton Sinclair write The Jungle. And so the progressives are going to push to have the Meat Inspection Act passed. You're going to have Ida Tarbell write about Standard Oil and the business practices. And when all of this stuff comes to light, that's when the government is going to start shifting. And they don't. It's not that they trusted workers. Or they stopped supporting big business, because big business was supporting us economically, but the government realized they need to step in and protect some of the workers and stuff because they were getting injured and stuff like that. So it wasn't a shift of trust. It was just an addition of saying, okay, we got to play a role in this and protect our workers, but also protect our economy as well. Okay. The cause of the War of 1812 was the impressment of sailors and by the British on the high seas, as well as the British also arming the Native Americans on the western frontier. Progressive reforms and amendments. The reforms, you have like the Meat Inspection Act, you have the Settlement House movement, the amendments, the 16th, the 17th, and the 18th Amendment. So the 16th Amendment was income tax, the 17th Amendment was the direct election of senators, and the 18th Amendment was the prohibition. The progressive movement, you saw the temperance movement during this time. You saw the women's suffrage movement during this time. Those are the different things that are going to happen, and the results are going to be, like I said, you're going to see laws passed as far as business. You're going to see the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act, those kind of things, all to protect the consumer and stuff like that. All right. The market revolution and the industrial revolution. The industrial revolution, I'll hit that one first. That's the rise of technology in our country. The market revolution is the rise, essentially, of markets where we're going to see new inventions coming in. We're going to see our economy expanding. The market revolution, you're going to see new inventions like the railroad. You're going to see the mechanical reaper. You're going to see the telegraph. And what that's going to do with the market revolution, that's going to expand our national economy. economy and turn it into a national economy. Take us from regional economies to national economies, okay? Panic at the Disco, yep. After women's suffrage. Oh, there's all sorts of women you should be familiar with. I'm just, oh my gosh, well, Rosa Parks. What's the woman who wrote the Feminine Mystique? I can see her. It'll come to me. Phyllis Schlafly, the conservative movement. Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman Supreme Court Chief Justice. Oh my gosh, who wrote the Feminine Mystique? I'm drawing an absolute blank. Someone will put it in there. I know. It'll come to me. Don't worry. But those are just a few of the names you have. Okay. The Great Society and the New Deal, mostly they had similarities. Both of them are going to increase the size and of the government. They're going to increase the influence of the government. Both of them are trying to reach what we call the forgotten man, those people who we feel have been left behind. Both are going to introduce new programs with the goal of improving the economy of the United States, and both of them are not going to have the long-term success that they hoped. But I think the biggest thing when you look at the Great Society and the New Deal is both of them increase the size and the influence of the government in our day-to-day life. Well, Shrey, if you haven't started studying, you're here now. You're not cooked. It depends on what you've done throughout the rest of the whole year. If you've been learning, you've been doing okay, I think you'll be all right. Just do a little bit of reviewing. You can say any methods just to... You know what I would do? I would watch videos like this. Maybe go look at some of Heimler's videos. I mean, I'm trying my best, but he's the GOAT, let's be honest. And again, get a good night's sleep. It is what it is at this point. You're not going to become a historian overnight. So get a good night's sleep, review notes tomorrow morning. You know, maybe listen to a couple review videos before you go into school, and then just go take the test and do your best. So, there we go. You have 4 hours to study. Where are you where you only have 4 hours left? Because the test is at 8 o'clock in the morning. Betty Friedan, thank you, Nomi. I knew you'd come through before me. Thank you. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. There we go. Thank you, Don, for all those names. Yes, yes, yes. Susan B. Anthony. Well, Susan B. Anthony was, yeah, you do need to know her, but she said, you know, that was before, yeah, or after women's suffrage. So we're okay. Unit 9, honestly, if you know Reaganomics, that's a good one to know. I would know a little bit about the War on Terror, so that's a good one. You know, Reaganomics is the big one. I don't think that, you know, time period 9 is really only 4% of the exam. So, and a lot of it, you know, because it's relatively current. So I think you'll be okay. Okay? Good stuff. I'm still waiting for that answer with Shrey, you only have 4 hours to study. Where are you that you only have 4 hours? Or are you just planning to get some sleep? So. Whew. What about Reagan's encourage? Yeah, Reagan's presidency encouraged trust in the government again, following a lot of, yeah. Okay, I'm going to be honest with you. The trust has never been completely regained. We can go back to the credibility gap, and we are still trying to rebuild that trust. Reagan tried to rebuild the trust, but then he's going to have some problems as well, like with the Iran-Contra scandal and stuff like that. So he might have gotten a little bit... Ford, I don't think Ford gained trust. I'm going to disagree with you, Alicia, because Ford just didn't really accomplish anything. And remember, Ford, he pardoned Nixon, and that's going to tick off a lot of people. So... Reagan tried. I just don't, I think there's such a gap between the public and the presidency that it's never been gained back, to be honest with you. The square deal, that is Teddy Roosevelt's, that's his domestic policy, where he was going to protect consumers, he was going to go after the corporations, and he was going to build conservation. So remember that with a square deal. He was protecting consumers, going after the corporation, and starting conservation of lands. Yeah, I mean, yeah, he doesn't even have a whole... I mean, we almost could have fit forward on the bottom of Nixon's page, honestly. So he did pardon Nixon, but you got to remember that ticked off a lot of people because Nixon was being impeached. And if had he not resigned, a lot of people, they told him he was going to be convicted. So, all right. Questions are slowing down. I'm slowing down. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say I'm going to go another, if I have questions come in, I'll go another 15 minutes. Well, I don't even know if I'll go 15. I'll just sort of talk here for a few minutes and see if any more questions come up. Just a reminder, there's been some questions about the structure of the test. I'll go over that once again. You're going to start with 55 multiple choice questions, which you'll have 55 minutes to answer. Then you're going to go right into the SAQs. The SAQs, you have 3 sets of SAQs. You'll have 40 minutes to do those. Your first set of SAQs is going to be 2 historians. You're going to have to compare and contrast 2 historians. So just be prepared for that. Your second SAQ is going to be a primary source document that you're going to have to answer questions on. Make sure you read the source. That's going to be very important. And then your third SAQ, you're going to have a choice between 2, and that's just going to be based on your knowledge. No stimulus or anything like that. Once you're done with the SAQs, you're going to get a 10-minute break. When that break's over, you're going to come back, and this is where you're going to the marathon session. 100 minutes to write your 2 essays. So, and then you'll be done, and then it'll all be over. Andrew Johnson's effect on Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson didn't have a lot of effect because he was battling with the radical Republicans, and they were trying to institute their Reconstruction policies. So he tried to get stuff done. He tried to veto their legislation, but they would override his veto. So his effect on Reconstruction was very weak. As far as the black codes, it was neither. I don't think that was Johnson. That was just local governments as essentially trying to gain control back. Johnson was impeached, but he was not convicted, and that's a big difference. When a president is impeached, impeachment says we have enough evidence to put you on trial, and that's what we're going to do. And when you are impeached, that means you go on trial in the Senate, and then you go on trial in the Senate, and that's where the trial actually happens. Johnson made it all the way to the trial in the Senate, but he was found not guilty by 1 vote. So impeached, yes. Convicted, no. We could do a practice multiple choice, but I don't have any that I could pull up for you. Period. That's a dead giveaway. Period. That's a dead giveaway. If you see words like all or none, those are dead giveaways. So eliminate 2. And then you're going to have 2. So now you have a 50-50 shot. When you go to look at those 2, again, look at the time period. Look at how the answer's worded. Sometimes those answers, both of them seem right, but there might be, and so, it's so unfair, but there might be just 1 word that throws it off. So just read those answers carefully. I hope that helps. For the DBQ, the specific reason for Johnson's impeachment was he violated the Tenure of Office Act. And what the Tenure of Office Act said was if a president, since the Senate has to approve president's appointments, that means the Senate has to approve if a president fires somebody. And what Johnson did was he fired the Secretary of War without congressional approval, so that's why he was impeached. Okay? For the documents with the DBQ, I recommend at the very minimum 4. You only have to summarize 3 documents to get a point. But if you want to get the full document points, do 4 documents and use that SPY. So summarize each document, explain how each document answers the prompt, and then tell me why the document was written. What did the author want to happen as a result of this document? Don't just say he wanted this document to record history. All those documents they provide for you have a very specific purpose. They want to convince somebody or something, or they want to demonstrate something, or they want to change something. Put that in there. That's the why in SPY, okay? I will be there tomorrow morning. I'm going to be there. I'm going to get there about 7:15, 7:20. The Second Great Awakening, what that did was the Second Great Awakening first, but that's how the abolition movement got started. The abolition movement was started by pastors who came out of the Second Great Awakening. So, okay, all right, how are we doing? Whew. I'm looking tired too. Goodness, this is what happens when you get old. When you hit a certain time of night, all the wrinkles come out. So, all right. 23 people here. You guys, yeah, we're getting to the point where I'm going to tell you, you guys are going to have to go to bed soon because I got to go to bed soon. And I just told Abby that I was going to be there at 7:15 in the morning. So, goodness gracious. Okay, this is when you get the mom in me. And I'm not a mom except for my dogs, but I'm not going to tell you to chew a bone. But here's the thing. You need to get a good night's sleep tonight. Eat a healthy breakfast tomorrow morning. Don't go and grab a bunch of donuts and sugar and all that stuff, because that is just you're gonna have a sugar high and then a sugar crash. Okay. How many docs do you need for full points for the P and SPY? Again, 4. You need to do 4 of those. So that's your goal. All right, no problem. You get a good night's sleep, and I'm happy to help you out. Seth, if you can do, if you are comfortable, I mean, 4 documents is kind of is my minimum. If you can do 5, that gives you one, just a backup in case you messed up one. So you need to get I think, and I don't have the rubric in front of me, so I believe you need to summarize 3 documents to get a point. You need to connect the 4 documents to the prompt to get a point, and then you need to source 2 documents. That's the Y in SPY. So if you just SPY 4 documents, you'll be fine. Okay? Good night, Abby. Thanks for coming. Okay. I think we're slowing down. So I think this is where I'm going to talk real slow to see if any more, most important thing to see. Okay, here is the simple answer of how Manifest Destiny expected the natives. They lost. They lost. I mean, every time we expanded, the Native Americans were pushed off their land. They tried to fight back, and generally they would lose. Now, do you want some wars? I mean, we start with King Philip's War. You have Pontiac's War. You have the Plains Indian War. I mean, they consistently lose. So, really, I mean, I that sounds harsh, but that's the easiest thing to remember. Seth, I'm glad we're helping you, man. You have me in the same sentence as Heimler. I'm just touched. So, okay. All right. Sad faces. I don't know why. What did I say that was sad? Maybe it was the Native American stuff. They lost. Yeah, that is kind of sad. So, and also, you got to remember too. We often overlook this. The Native Americans, remember, when I'm going all the way back to the beginning, the Columbian Exchange, all that disease. We're talking 90 to 95% of the Native American population was wiped out before any of the westward expansion really started. So, Alicia, you're too kind. Yeah. So it's, that disease really had a huge effect. Yeah, Alicia, I know he's reading those super chats, and I was telling my students today, why would you throw money at that? I just don't understand that. You guys, money. I'm saying your name right now, and it's not costing you anything. So you know what? It's just the super chats are. But I mean, good on him, because he has worked hard to get his channel where it is. And I'm not knocking him at all, because I've learned a lot from just watching him as well. The Watergate scandal, simply put, Richard Nixon was worried that he was going to lose the election of 1972. The polls showed him a little bit ahead. And so what he's going to do is he's going to look to his campaign advisors, and what they're going to do is they're going to break into the Watergate building, an office there, and they're going to try to spy on the Democratic committee to determine what their campaign strategies are. They're going to get caught. Nixon is going to claim no knowledge of the break-in. And what's going to end up happening is he's going to say, I can prove that I have no knowledge because I have tapes, because I tape every single conversation in my office. Well, when he was finally forced to turn over the tapes, part of the tapes were missing. What Nixon got in trouble for was lying. That's what he got in trouble for. He lied about the tapes. He lied about his knowledge with the Watergate scandal. So that's going to lead to him being the possibility of impeachment. Okay. Do you know if it's fun? No, it's not fun being an AP grader. I did it for 5 years. It's not fun at all. It's long, it's tedious, and we have to read all your essays. Now, when you read a good essay, it's fun. When you read a funny essay, it's fun. But it's a lot of work. But it's worth it. It's totally worth it to be part of that too. To be part of the grading system, to see the work that you guys put into it. So, I mean, no, if you find me a teacher that said they became a teacher so they could read essays all day, and I'll find someone who needs some help, because it's not fun, but it's there's a reward to it as well, though. So I don't want to say it's not all dredge. There's a reward, because we do, as a reader, you get to see what you guys know. That, and I'm going to get a little sentimental, that at your age, the way that the products that you can produce and the voice that you have and how you can use that voice when you write, that's kind of cool to see that stuff come across. Okay. What shifted Americans from individualism to conformity? Mass media, the TV. I think that's a lot of it. Just like social media today. Look at how social media affects our society, and how, look at 6-7. I hate saying it, and I've set myself up again. But look at what social media, where everyone's 6-7, 6-7. Well, that's what happened in the 50s. You had TV come out, and TV was the latest, greatest thing, and it presented this picture of the perfect family. And so everybody was working to be that idea of perfection. So they started conforming to that image, because that image represented success. It represented, what we consider the perfect American family. And so that's what it was. I think it was also coming out of the war. All of we were tired. We just wanted to get back to just being. And so conformity, I think, kind of made it easier for us to do that. So, all right. Whoops. Class of 23. Hey, Jonah, how are you doing? Jonah was he was a superstar. He was one of my superstars. Jonah, I think you were my last class over at Clark before I moved. So. All right, I'm scrolling up here. Purely the Red Scare. I think the Red Scare is it kind of coincides with conformity, because then we use conformity to measure if someone we saw was a threat, So like I said, it kind of all happened at the same time. Difference between the first and second Red Scare. First Red Scare, 1920s, we were afraid of the spread of socialism and anarchy in our country, and it was spurred by immigrants coming into our country. The second Red Scare, we're afraid of communism within our government, because we had found some spies in our government, so we were fearful that we would almost be taken down from within by communism. So. I've been asked a half a dozen times about the LEQ prompts. I have no idea what the LEQ prompts are going to be, because they come from 3 different time periods. So, they could be anything. Only one of the Kennedys was president. JFK was the president. His brother Bobby was his attorney general. Both of them, though, were assassinated. Okay, I just talked about the first and second Red Scare. The various major labor unions, the Knights of Labor, the ALF, it's the AFL. They are both of these were craft unions. I think lasting impact. The AFL, started by Samuel Gompers, still around today. The Knights of Labor lost its mojo after the Haymarket Square riot, when a lot of people associated the unions with socialism. So a lot of people quit the unions, and it was earlier, so it was like the 1860s, 1870s. The AFL is going to come along, craft union, but it's still around today. Yeah, the one that broke off from the AFL, it's called the CIO. and I can't remember what Central Industrial Organization or something like that. So it's the AFL-CIO. 1730s Great Awakening, that was a huge religious revival that spread from Europe over here. But what it did was it introduced independent thinking, meaning that we don't need a king or a pope to tell us about our faith. That is based on our personal relationship with Jesus. So we can independently choose what we believe. Favorite unit to teach? You know what? A lot of teachers hate the Gilded Age. I have come to love the Gilded Age. I think I love teaching. I love teach. It's easier, Seth, for me to say that I hate teaching periods 1 and 2. I find those kind of drab, and I just want to get through them so we can get to the Revolutionary Era. If I had to pick, if you said I could only pick one unit to teach, it would probably be either the Gilded Age or Unit 8, just because there's so much going on during those time periods. And I think that's why I like them, because there's a lot of different threads that are being woven together to create those time periods. Okay, it's 10:45. I'm going to call it. I'm going to go ahead and say that this is it, that it's time for you to go to bed. It's time for me to go to bed. I hope I was able to help you tonight. I want to thank Ms. Pahovich, who was helping at the beginning. Thank Mr. Rios, who's been throwing a lot of stuff in here throughout. I apologize again for the streaming problems that we had. Oh, you're throwing more questions at me, and I'll try to answer these very quickly. You guys are killing me with these last minute questions. All right, here we go. Real quick. Pros and cons of Reconstruction. The pros is all the states came back into the Union. The cons, we did not solve the problems of Reconstruction. We still had racism. We still had division. Did modern feminism influence the change of women voting from aligning with their husbands to voting for themselves? I'm sure it did. I don't have actual living proof of that, but I'm sure it did have a role in women voting, independently. But to be in all honesty, a lot of women probably were already voting independently because we had secret ballot. They just didn't tell their husband. The difference for the Second Great Awakening, what the Second Great Awakening did, again, another religious revival, but it talked about Christianity being the moral leaders of society and that they should step in and do that. But the Second Great Awakening is going to inspire the reform movements of the 1830s and 40s, where the First Great Awakening is an inspiration for the move for independence and the drive for independence in the American Revolution. Yeah, Alicia, 8:44, that means you're out in California. Whatever. Love it. All right. Thanks, you know me. All right, guys. I hit all those last questions. You guys are going to do great tomorrow. Get a good night's sleep. Remember, when you first open the very first question of the test, you are going to absolutely panic and you're going to forget everything you know right now. Take a deep breath. It's going to come back to you and you're going to do great. Don't doubt yourself. You're going through the multiple choice questions. Trust your gut. Just do it. When you're doing the SAQs and planning it, when you're doing the writing, plan it all out. All right? And you'll do fine. But again, Mr. Rios, thank you very much. Good night, everybody. Praying for you to have a great day tomorrow. If you want to come back next year, I'll be back next year. I probably should start doing more of these live reviews again because I do enjoy them even though I get tired. But you guys, thank you very much and good night.